This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning to you. Head of NATO is currently giving a speech in which he warns that Vladimir Putin is not remotely interested in peace, describes him as ramping up the rhetoric and the reckless aggression. It's a timely reminder, really, of one of the key challenges that faces Keir Starmer. We're going in today. I'm going in on a question to which no one can provide a definitive answer. There will be no rounds of applause. It's highly unlikely there'll be any Ray Liotas. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you don't listen to the programme enough. And that's a you problem, frankly, not a me problem. But with the prevailing wind, I sometimes like to ask you questions that provide an opportunity really for the journey to be the reward rather than the destination, if you like. The means is the end in itself. And a couple of front pages today focus on the question of Keir Starmer's challenge now. Starmer, I want even closer ties with the US, on the front page of the Times. And on the front page of the Telegraph, Starmer, I will not side with Trump over Europe. Which demonstrates a couple of things, doesn't it? It demonstrates precisely the sort of Scylla and Charybdis that he is caught between, but also how journalism can reflect the same, quotes, facts, end quotes, through rather different refracting lenses. But the central thrust of both pieces is the same. He's not going to side with America against the EU, but neither is he going to side with Europe or the EU against America. So when he says, I want closer ties with the US, he is simultaneously saying that I'm not going to prioritise them over the EU, which, of course, Trump's allies have urged him to do, one of them describing the socialist project of the European Union. I was thinking this morning, I mean, goodness knows, I was thinking this morning that the impossibility of reporting on the next 4 or 5 years in America through any sort of lens of normality. Do you know what I mean? As soon as you start talking about Keir Starmer's challenge, you are reporting the White House, the Trump White House, as if it's just the latest in a long line of White Houses. You ignore all of the absolutely heart-stopping evidence that we are probably embarked upon a period of unprecedented democratic decline in America. You just look at the people that he's putting into key roles. They've all either given him a ton of money or owe him fealty or have family connections with him or have promised to wreak revenge on the people who committed the cardinal sin of telling the truth about the result of the 2020 election. So these are mad, mad times. And yet what do? Do you talk about... You can't talk endlessly. I'd be tempted to talk endlessly about how awful he is. But Keir Starmer can't do that. I don't think Keir Starmer can do that. So the first question is, how should Keir Starmer deal with Donald Trump? Because we couldn't really be in a worse position, could we, as a country? You've got a psychotic White House about to be activated, and we have left the European Union, and we sit between the two. That's what I mean by it is Scylla and Charybdis, isn't it? I got it from a Police song. I think it might have something to do with classic mythology. For many years, I thought it was Scylla and Charybdis, and for a very small period of time, I thought it had something to do with Cilla Black. But no. So the Scylla and Charybdis are those two rocks that meet each other and smash the ships between them. It's not the perfect metaphor for where Keir Starmer finds himself, but his challenge is to keep both parties sweet. The suggestion is that he needs to choose between either Europe or the US. But last night in the Mansion House speech, it's a very good foreign policy speech, actually. But the problem, of course, with this country at the moment is that we're more interested in trivia than we are in things like foreign policy. That's a criticism of myself as much as it is of anybody else. But the words he used were, it is plain wrong to suggest that Mr. Trump's return to the White House meant Britain had to either get closer to Europe or to the US. He believes he can build bridges to both continents. He promised to, quote, invest more deeply than ever in this transatlantic bond with our American friends. And simultaneously, he pledged to rebuild our ties with Europe too. So, should we open Idiot's Corner early? Here you go. Here's James. Mad times, James, when the US president pardons his son. Not one mention of that. No, mate, just a whole hour on it yesterday, you absolute Rice Krispie. Get in Idiot's Corner quickly before you hurt yourself. Now, can he do it? This is all on you, by the way. I don't know. I follow things quite closely, but as we demonstrated yesterday when we were talking about, spoiler alert, Joe Biden pardoning his son Hunter, there are a couple of calls that really demonstrated a much better grasp of the facts than the average bear has. I think first perhaps of Claire in York. Was it Claire in York or was it another caller who described the realisation that you're comparing apples with pears when it comes to our legal systems? And another caller talking about the constitutional differences between America, which shed fascinating light on yesterday's conversation. But and that's why there's a slight wariness in my voice today. I like days like this as a radio phone-in host. I like to offer up quite meaty, difficult questions to which I don't have much of an answer myself. The days on which I feel that I'm just tearing up the wing and hopping over every tackle are the days when my opinion is so strong I can almost get the engine started single-handedly, you know? That's me turning the crankshaft on the engine if you're watching on YouTube, by the way. But the days where I throw the floor open to you and cross my fingers that you do know that what I'm talking about, then, or you know more about this than I do, then sometimes the magic happens. And sometimes it doesn't, but that's on me. What's on you at the moment is this. Can he do this? Can he talk about the situation that we're in with regards to Europe without decrying the idiocy of Brexit, for example? Can he talk about building closer ties without better articulating the idiocy of cutting the old ones? Can he really posit a warmer relationship with an American administration that is, when I use the word corrupt, I mean a corruption of norms, traditions and decency. It's utterly corrupt. You have an adjudicated rapist moving into the White House. You have people who have inflated his lies and absurdities being put into key positions. You have people who have given him money or given him fealty or kissed his ring being promoted into positions of epic power from, most obviously, the head of the FBI, the touted head of the FBI, has subscribed to the most bonkers of lies and conspiracy theories with regards to the January the 6th riots, the election and beyond. So what can Starmer do? It's an extraordinary, and I use that word advisedly, position in which to find himself. Cut loose from Europe and looking across the Atlantic at a potentially hostile regime. One glimmer of hope is that I think Trump can be treated like a toddler. I think even if he was screaming at you yesterday and smearing the walls with his food, I think if you give him a biscuit today, he can be sort of mollified. I don't know that you see this with his relations with his own party. People that spoke out against him, as long as they bend the knee, can be welcomed back into the fold and even promoted. So I don't know that anything lasts for very long in Trump world. I think even his vendettas expire. So maybe Starmer can, in some sense, build an entente over the Atlantic. But goodness me, the choice between Europe and America seemed to me, before this speech, to be at the very top of Keir Starmer's to-do list. And yet he insists that the choice does not have to be made at all. It's a papal term. I believe it's part of the rubric of the Catholic Church. Or kings did it as well, where you kiss the ring of a cardinal, or you kiss the ring of a monarch. It was a religious, I don't know why, but I appreciate that some of you are slightly discombobulated by that. But spoiler alert, that's exactly why I said it. 12 minutes after 10 is the time. Let's get the phone lines open. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. The challenge, in a way, is best expressed by David Lammy, isn't it? The Foreign Secretary, who correctly called Donald Trump a tyrant and a sociopath, but now has to treat him like an extremely influential and powerful ally. And then you hop over the other waters, you look over the English Channel towards the European Union, and you see A troubled entity. France in particular is facing all manner of problems at the moment, but still in trade terms, a strong bloc that we're not in. So what on earth is Keir Starmer supposed to do with regards to the twin calls of Donald Trump's United States and the still unified European Union? Can he do this? Draw on anything you've got for this, and I will. I don't think we'll have. Well, no, we won't. It's if I haven't got a particularly pertinent insight, then I can't really get cross with you for not having any. So bring whatever you've got to the table on this one. I think it might be one of the most important political gambits of the 21st century so far for a UK Prime Minister. In a way, it's old-fashioned politics. It's not self-inflicted manic idiocy like Brexit or the inevitable consequences of that, which meant putting absolute weapons into Downing Street, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson most obviously. This is the kind of dilemma that any Prime Minister would face, albeit it has the added spice of the self-inflicted damage of Brexit, making this perhaps it's an inevitable, perhaps it's a necessity that the EU and the US have to be treated as equal because we're not actually in bed with either of them anymore. I wonder whether anyone wants to have a crack at trying to posit this as a Brexit benefit. I mean, if you can pull that off, I'll give you the money myself, but we are nothing if not open-minded. We want to have a crack at explaining that by dint of not being in the European Union, we can keep one foot in Europe and one foot in the United States. We could certainly get exemptions from tariffs if he were to introduce them, which he has promised he will do. But as I say, give him a biscuit tomorrow, and yesterday's threats sometimes or often disappear. So the claim that Keir Starmer that the adults were returning to the room, albeit that they've had a suboptimal start, it still holds true. I will be telling you later in the programme how much Suella Braverman spent on sending nobody to Rwanda, and you won't believe your ears, especially if you're looking at some right-wing attempts to see Louise Haig's severance package as a story or a scandal, when I don't know how many noughts you'd have to add to that to get even close to Suella Braverman's bill for a scheme that succeeded in removing precisely nobody from this country, but that's coming up a little later. You look at the political landscape, you have a sensible, if imperfect, Prime Minister in place charged with a really, really, really difficult choice. He says he doesn't have to make it. Keir Starmer says it is plain wrong to suggest that Trump's return to the White House means he either has to get close to Europe or to the US. Question number one, is he right? Can he avoid picking a side? 0345 6060 973. And, well, let's just leave it at that, shall we, to start with. Can Keir Starmer truly, as he insists he can, avoid picking a side when issues like tariffs, trade, Ukraine, Vladimir Putin are all not just on the horizon, but in clear sight already? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 10:16 is the time. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. I've got another phone in, which I don't think fits in today, but it might, which is how the hell does Keir Starmer deal with the depravity that is Donald Trump? I genuinely don't know. It may bleed into today's conversation, but that's always, since the election result came in the back of my mind. How do you deal with it? It's fine for a gob on a stick on the radio. I can keep reminding you of all the disgusting and depraved things he's done and the moral bankruptcy of anybody in my line of work that does anything other than detail and list the horror show that represents his personal, professional and political life. But I don't think you can do that if you're Prime Minister. So keep that one bubbling away in the background as well. The time is 10:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 10 is the time. I don't think, sorry to go on, but I don't think you can stress the urgency of a situation that has Vladimir Putin, as the head of NATO has been saying this morning, embarked upon a reckless and aggressive path built entirely upon rhetorical lies, and Donald Trump in the White House, and Europe caught in between the two. Because if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, what were people saying to us from the very, very start? And what I like about this politically is that everybody agreed that we were doing the right thing in Ukraine. Boris Johnson inevitably tried to make it about Boris Johnson and did several laps of honour, but it was true that we stepped up to the plate diplomatically with regard to Ukraine. So if they are now to be abandoned, what do people do? So there's so much at stake, which makes the question of what Keir Starmer can and should do arguably the most important of his premiership so far. Certainly, if you look beyond the borders of the United Kingdom, it is the most important question of his premiership so far. What should he do with regard to the competing entities of the EU and the USA? What should he do? Philip's in Bognor Regis. Philip, what would you like to say?
Well, I think you don't...
We may never find out, but we'll stay on the coast because Stuart's in Plymouth. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Hi. Okay, so I'm not a fan of Keir. I was actually at school with him at the grammar for a few years. But
were you? Well, at the same time?
Same time, yeah.
And you didn't
from him.
And you didn't like him then?
No, I would say I was neither here nor there with him. We weren't that sort of close or anything, but He was all right, I suppose. He kept his head in his books.
Yeah.
He was an academic, did his studies, liked his football.
Down with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So where are we today?
Well, yeah, I'm not a fan of his politically, but I think this is the first time he said something I tend to agree with, actually.
Yes.
And I think the position we need to take or try to take, which isn't going to be particularly easy, but is to become like the middleman broker between the EU and the US would be a good position to be in, a bit like Egypt with Mubarak between the Middle East and the Western world, and could be mutually beneficial all round. But to pile us up one against the other, that's not going to work. We're going to pay a price one way or the other.
He cited, I don't know whether you know this, but he cited Attlee and Churchill, who both, to varying degrees, arguably played precisely the role that you described. But they were dealing with, I don't know quite what word to use. I'll go for rational or traditional American presidents.
Yeah. Well, it's more of a challenge with Trump, isn't it?
And the Understatement of the Year award is making its way to Plymouth today.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to have to deal with the guy, I must admit. But the EU can be challenging as well.
That's for sure, but but only in a traditional and rational way.
In a traditional way.
Not in
more rational.
Knocking, the old adage about playing chess with a pigeon, and they knock all the pieces.
To be honest, Trump's not entirely stupid, and I think he plays on that unpredictability. It can be a strength because it can throw your opponent off. He's good at that. I
would go further. I would go further, inspired by you, and I would wonder whether it would be, given that Trump is Trump, and this is why I wanted that side order of a phone-in about how the hell you deal with somebody as quixotic and corrupt as Trump, but you can't make an enemy of it. I mean, is that appeasement? You can't make an enemy of someone as mad as him.
Yeah, you could call it appeasement. Maybe there's a place for appeasement, but you can't make an enemy of him or America. I mean, there are checks and balances in places in the States. They have got quite strong political...
Well, they have for now, but he's putting his cronies in charge of everything from the FBI to the
he is.
It's already in the Senate. So yeah, okay, I like that. I like the idea of a Starmer skeptic thinking that this is what statesmanship looks like.
Yeah, it's positive. I will back him on this one. I do think he's got the right idea, but I wouldn't envy his position. I don't envy it. I think he's got a very difficult he's got a difficult role to play there, or try to get sorted out. But he is a bright man.
It's one of those moments that makes you wonder why anybody would want to be Prime Minister in the first place, except for reasons of personal vanity, which I don't think apply to him. Before you go, anything from his school days that hasn't been reported yet?
Yeah, but I don't know if I could tell you.
Are you serious?
Well, no, there's not much.
Don't say it on the back. You can tell Eleanor off air, and then we'll take a view on whether or not we can share it on air. Scale of 1 to 10, how interesting is it?
No, nothing. Okay, the only thing that really stands out, in all honesty,
go on.
I did see. I was one day, like Midsummer's Day, beautiful sunny day, walking between school blocks, loads of us walking backwards and forwards, and there was a furore. And as I'm walking by, there's a guy called Matthew Wiley.
Oh, careful! I'm worried now. You're not going to libel anyone, are you?
The name.
No.
You're
not going to say anything that Matthew Wiley might be cross about, are you?
I don't think so.
Oh,
I
I'm
used
very
to be friends
worried.
with Matthew.
Yeah, but you're
I was
not
friends with-
anymore. This is terrible. This is why live radio is both simultaneously fantastic and terrifying.
I'm going to get the food.
Keith, hang on,
my
I've just got to
life's
talk to
over.
Keith. Keith, get that finger ready. All right? On the dump button. Carry on.
So, yeah, anyway, Matthew could always handle himself. He was a friend of mine.
Right.
But the reason I liked Matthew was because if he hit people,
Yes.
generally they deserved it. He would stand
Oh, I
up
like
to you
that.
against
Yeah,
the
he was an
bully.
equal opportunities puncher.
He was equal opportunities.
Yeah.
But him and Keir were having the most almighty punch-up, and I do mean punch-up. It wasn't a scuffle.
Really?
It was,
This is
it
brilliant.
was fist to face, their heads knocking back. I'm
Oh,
standing
my
there going,
days.
what the hell? And I stood there for a few seconds, and like everybody else, I just kept walking, basically.
Yeah. What, do we know why? Do we know what had happened?
No, never found out why. No idea. But
We need to talk to Matthew Wiley.
I'll give Keir credit, though.
Go on.
He stood his ground. He was given as good as he took.
This
was
gives
given-
us hope. This gives us hope for the negotiations with Donald Trump,
does.
doesn't it,
Perfect.
Stuart? This is the perfect
He's a tough
preparation.
guy.
Well, you live and learn. That call went to all sorts of places that normal radio programmes cannot reach. I'm grateful to you. And that's why I mentioned the scepticism to start with. Well, I didn't know we were going to have the fisticuffs because he did. I mean, I reject it utterly is a strong phrase to use, especially for someone who's often typified as being well, not the kind of lad that would get into a fist fight in the school playground. Against the backdrop of these dangerous times, he said, the idea that we must choose between our allies, that somehow we're either with America or Europe is plain wrong. I reject it utterly. Attlee did not choose between allies. Churchill did not choose. The national interest demands that we work with both. Question, can he? Can he really? John's in Dublin. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Great to talk to you. I think it's a Brexit benefit, but because Starmer and the UK are outside of the diplomatic wranglings that go on in Europe,
Yes.
Starmer could set himself, or he could certainly set people in his cabinet up as very strong proponents of democracy between the oligarchy of Europe, or the oligarchy of Russia, and the emergent oligarchy of the US. And he can pander all he likes to Trump, but hold those democratic values very, very strongly.
But then they'll fall out, won't they? At some point, I mean, can he? Because Trump does seem embarked upon a course of, let's say, at the very least, democratic dilution.
He does, but he can also be pandered to, as you say.
Yes.
He can be given a biscuit day in, day out. He can be invited hither and thither. And as long as the support for Ukraine is not diminished sizably, as long as it's
and what if it is, though?
Through,
sorry to keep hitting you over the head with hypotheticals. I'm like a young Keir Starmer in the school playground. What if it is? What if he does abandon Ukraine on day one? He said he's going to end the war. It's hard to see how it can end happily for Ukraine unless Vladimir Putin's nose is put out of joint. And I don't think Donald Trump is minded to do that.
Well, he can, yes, but Starmer can put him in a position where he believes that he can manipulate the European Union through Starmer, and in that way not pull out of supporting Ukraine.
And where's the line?
So-
Where's the line between pandering and appeasement? I suppose it would involve Trump embarking on a military course, doing things that involve invasions of other countries, and us pretending or us convincing ourselves that it's not going to be as bad as some people say it is. And for all his faults, I don't think Trump has any international imperial ambitions.
No, but he has isolationist ambitions.
Yes, exactly.
And he wants to pull America back. And if that can be proven to be a win, as in Europe is buying arms or whatever from, or supplies from the US, that could be portrayed as a win. But what he can do is assemble members of his cabinet to be very strongly pro-Ukraine, pro-Europe, set a balance within Europe that allows Europe to come together in support of democratic values.
And it's a role that we couldn't have played perhaps as members of the European Union. So, I mean, it may be, albeit in fairly grim circumstances, a Brexit benefit of sorts. to be able to play this mediating role. Remember that the European Union didn't exist when Clement Attlee and Winston Churchill rejected utterly the idea that you have to choose between Europe or America, although some historians would possibly suggest that they... they chose both at different times and with regard to different issues. So the notion of Keir Starmer being able to pull this off gathers pace, or at least it being the right thing to do. Your thoughts, please, on 0345 60 We now have the final figure. The ballpark figure was already known, but as a consequence of a Freedom of Information request, we have the full breakdown of spending on the so-called Rwanda scheme. It's not as a consequence of that. They turned down the Freedom of Information request, but the new government, has now published the data regarding one of the flagship policies of the old government. And when you think about all the noise that is made about money by right-wing media, by the people that told you Brexit would be brilliant, Boris Johnson was a stand-up guy, Liz Truss was an economic genius, austerity was a necessary response to the actions of bankers who were largely untouched by its consequences. You look at how exercised they get by today. Conveniently enough, I think Louise Haigh walks away with 16 grand of severance payment after stepping down as Transport Secretary. The figures involved in this story are actually beyond my ken. I'm not stupid. I have my moments, I grant you, but I'm not objectively stupid. And I do this for a living. I have no idea how they could have spent. The only story like it is the COVID contracts. Where did all the money go? Where did all the money go? And when you find out how much money is involved in this, or the finer detail, you may already know the ballpark figure, the finer detail, I think you'll be shouting that even more loudly than me. 10:32 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:34. Andrew writes, the game ends if Trump pulls out of Ukraine. Europe is our home, and that buzzard that's not necessarily the word that Andrew has used, will sell us down the river as soon as he gets the chance. Yes, you are stupid on a daily basis, Mr. O'Brien. Let us never forget that he is a fascist. I think that's the bit about me being stupid on a daily basis is fair, but I don't think anyone on this programme is in danger of forgetting the march towards fascism that Donald Trump seems to represent, or the depravity and corruption of his previous administration, his behaviour in between, and almost certainly his next administration. And that word appeasement hangs over us, doesn't it, as a nation? Depending on your age, I suppose, but the words Neville Chamberlain appear almost immediately in your consciousness as soon as you hear the word appeasement. And what do you do with a despot? What do you do with leaders as vile and dangerous as Vladimir Putin? Well, I suppose if you're Nigel Farage, you write them fan mail, don't you? Both publicly and presumably privately as well. But the question for normal politicians, for proper politicians, is how do you deal with improper politicians? And the national interest probably demands that you deal with improper politicians properly. And that will involve something that comes perilously close to what we would traditionally call appeasement. So I suppose it depends on how Trump treats human beings. What would be the metaphorical equivalent of invading Poland? He's not going to do anything like that, but abandoning Ukraine might sit somewhere similar on a historical scale of realpolitik morality. Abandoning Ukraine, invading Poland. At that point, does Starmer come back from Washington, D.C. with a piece of paper? I genuinely don't. I haven't got a Scooby-Doo, as I'm sure you can tell, but the conversation is an interesting one, thanks largely to you. And now it continues. Chris is in Preston. Chris, what do you reckon?
For once, James, I think we're on a similar page. I'm glad we've got Keir Starmer here. I listen to you quite often, but we disagree on nearly everything.
It's always slightly worrying, but let's not dwell on it for today.
I'm glad we've got Keir Starmer where we have, because even though I voted Reform, I'm glad it's not Nigel Farage dealing with the Trump administration.
Right. Well, there's the first answer to the stuff that we disagree on. But let's genuinely, yeah. I'm talking to myself now, not to you. Let's focus on the phone-in that we're having and not deal with all the other baggage that you've just lobbed into my studio like a hand grenade.
No, I think having Keir Starmer where we have, I think, is a good situation. Because I think the way he's got to play off America is continuing dialogue, is continuing how we do it. I don't think David Lammy should be the closest person we've got to America, even though he's Foreign Secretary. I think we need someone a bit more level-headed, and not necessarily level-headed. Probably going to have an easier ride getting on with a very turbulent, turbulent president.
Someone a bit more Starmer-like, really, is what you're saying.
If we could have Starmer as Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, I think that would be best of both. But unfortunately, he can't split in two. It's a hard one. I think. And
what are the key things for you? Is it Ukraine, NATO? What are the key things that you think are in need of? The safe pair of hands is the phrase we use a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a fair point. I think NATO, having worked with NATO, I think it's a big point. I think we can't have someone like Donald Trump that's going to pull out. We need that alliance across. But I also think that goes again into the EU and gives us a bit of a stronger bargaining chip. Is that the EU needs us with NATO? They can't throw all their toys out the pram. I know they're two separate organisations, but the British presence in Europe for NATO is a big influence, and I think the EU will rely on that, and they can't just throw all their toys out the pram if we disagree on something.
And what is the line Trump could cross that would signal the need for Starmer to, and I can say this now with a bit more context than I could have done before 10 o'clock this morning, for Starmer to take the gloves off and start swinging?
Into Russia or into Trump?
Yeah, well, I mean, what would be the kind of, it could be Russia, it could be anything, but it's abandonment of Ukraine, most obviously. Would you still be making this call then and saying, no, he's abandoned Ukraine, that's something we've got to deal with, Starmer's got to hang in there and carry on keeping the lines of communication open?
I think we'd always have to have that line of communication with the US. We can never turn that off. They're too big of a player. There's too many vested interests into the UK, and we have too many vested interests over there. We can't just turn that off. It's got to continue. I think the abandonment of Ukraine is going to be a killer for us. Ukraine's the breadbasket of Europe and Africa, and that's why we've got so much famine and
But I think Trump would do it in a heartbeat, wouldn't he? If either he was compelled to, or if he felt that it was going to play well at home. He said a lot while he was campaigning, a lot about it being a huge drain on US resources. It's a popular position in the States.
And it is a massive drain on US resources. But do we see Russia stopping at Ukraine, or do we see them rolling onto the alliance and into Europe? I think that's the hardest part to guess. And unfortunately, when you've got a madman trying to deal with a madman, it's hard for Keir Starmer, as possible as he may or may not be, to sit in the middle of that.
That's a brilliant way of putting it. When you've got a madman dealing with a madman, what on earth are you supposed to do? I'm going to steal that, Chris, with your permission.
Very fair.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a problem.
Thank you. I'm tempted to dive into some of the other areas that we would obviously have slightly less harmonious conversations about, but today is not the day. Thank you. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Richard in Chelmsford is one of the people still clinging to the notion that using the word fascism is unhelpful. Don't ask me to provide you with a definition, Richard. Just find your own. Far right, a tick. Authoritarian, tick. Ultranationalist, tick. Forcible suppression of opposition. He's just appointed someone to the FBI who has said he's going to lock up journalists. And this isn't even a matter of academic debate anymore. It's not even an opinion. It's just counting. Autocracy. It's all there, mate. It's all there. So, it's in the dictionary just before fathead. Ben's in Brighton. Ben, what would you like to say?
Oh, I'm actually in Benidorm, but
thanks
for taking my call.
What's wrong with Brighton?
Yes, I am. Brighton's lovely, but I'm in Benidorm, actually, as it happens. I was just going to say, firstly, just to address what your previous caller said, I thought he was a very intelligent man, but I listened to John Bolton the other day talking about how important, and John Bolton is hardly in a feet liberal, right? But John Bolton said that our influence with the United States is now far less, thanks to us being outside of the EU.
He did.
He said that, and he's kept repeating this, by the way. He said that.
Well, he's not infallible. He's someone worth listening to. But just because John Bolton said it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true.
No, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. But I'm trying to go for the kind of people I normally disagree with.
Yeah, fair enough. Good point.
I also think that this should not be a difficult choice for Keir Starmer. It definitely should not be a difficult choice. We are talking here about a Labour government, right? If a Labour government is willing to say that it's happy to ally itself with somebody who is described by their own chief of staff, their own previous chief of staff, as a fascist, right?
Yes.
And treat them.
Don't tell Richard in
Democrats.
Chelmsford that, will you? Whatever you do, the poor fellow will have an embolism. Go on.
But when we've got across the water, we have our closest trading partners, and we have people that are essentially, whether they're from the right or the left, right, share our values.
Well, come off it. Marine Le Pen could be overthrowing Emmanuel Macron or Michel Barnier in the course of the next few days.
But I do not think. I mean, not even Marine Le Pen or
she's not going to be
Georgia
taking
Meloni.
over the EU. That's a good point.
No,
the
exactly.
entity is different.
Exactly. And I think that it should be really, really obvious to all of us who care about democracy, care about liberal values, that the way forward is with the people we have most in common with. We should not be allying ourselves with or pretending we can square this weird circle.
Well, that's different. They're two different things. Allying ourselves with would involve favouring them over the European Union. Starmer's position is not that at all. What he rejects utterly is the idea that he has to be either with America or with Europe. He says you can be with both. You're flirting with the word appeasement, aren't you? You're flirting with the idea that even by treating an improper politician properly, you legitimise and normalise the impropriety. And I worry about that. But I don't see. I mean, what is Keir Starmer? He's the arch pragmatist, isn't he? He's the Ming vase carrier. He what else can he do? He can't alienate Donald Trump. The consequences would be immediate. That he is a petulant child who would impose tariffs. I think he would, at least, just out of a sort of form of personal spite.
But I think he's probably going to do that anyway. I mean, I think that.
Well, you've got to try and stop him, and then if he does, you've failed. But if you don't try at all, that's a dereliction of duty. Surely.
Well, but we're talking here about a Labour Prime Minister who is willing to, and I'm going to use the word now, appease someone who has been described by his former Chief of Staff as a fascist. Someone who you describe rightly as an adjudicated rapist.
Well, his own Vice President wondered whether he might prove to be America's Hitler. So, Richard in Chelmsford notwithstanding, the number of people very, very close to him have arrived at the same conclusion as the people who abhor him is stunning. But he's not. I mean, he hasn't launched a military coup. He failed to overthrow the result of the last election. He moves into the White House with a mandate as a consequence of a democratic poll, and therefore he is someone with whom Keir Starmer should and will do business.
Well, all manner of terrible people have moved into places of power with democratic consensus.
So you'd cut the cord, you'd cut the rope.
I would say that the only way to do it would be to decide now that we're going to have much, much closer ties with Europe, and not you don't want to pick a fight, obviously. I mean, that seems to me to be crazy. But what we do have to say now is we have to say, look, we stand with people that share our own values, and Trump does not share our own values. As I say, when you have so many people on the same page, from the right and the left,
from his own team. I mean, you like me probably naively thought that would carry some salience with the electorate in the United States when his own national security chief or his own chief of staff is calling him a fascist, and his own vice presidential pick has compared him to Hitler. You'd think some of the voters might have gone, hang on a minute. Hang on just a minute, but no, that's yet another example of the Liberals just not getting it. Although, of course, what it is they're not getting is how popular fascism can be. Thank you, Ben, in Benidorm. I've said for almost the entire time I've been presenting this programme that one day, I might do this when I retire, I'll try and do a show where the only contributors have a name that is also the first syllable of their location. There was a Halifax advert many years ago, which you'd need to be roughly my age to remember. And it was trying to do a kind of everyman. So it was Col in Colchester. It wasn't Ben in Benidorm, because that wouldn't be very relevant to to a British bank. No, it wouldn't be Ben in Brighton. It'd be Ben in Benenden, Keith. Honestly, Hal in Halifax would be good. Pete in Peterborough. We're a bit light on female names on this one. What might be a nice female? So I wanted, one day I will do this. This is my little promise to myself. It's pretty much the only ambition I've got left. I'll conduct an entire phone-in programme where every contributor has the first syllable of their location repeated in their name. Bev in Beverley. That's why we pay Eleanor the big bucks.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Complicated can this be, honestly? I despair some days. Lorraine in London. Writes Kevin. That's as bad as Keith saying, what did he say? Ben in Brighton. Steve in Stevenage works. Thank you, Gareth. Liv in Liverpool works. Brent in Brentford works on all sorts of levels. Bernie in Burnley, Jonathan, doesn't work. Burn in Burnley would work. It's got to be an identical first syllable. I thought this would be the easiest game in the world. Here's a tricky one. Greetings from Leo in Leominster. But if you're familiar with that part of the Midlands, if you've seen the road signs or if you know the town, you'd know that Leominster is actually spelt Leo-minster. So do we let Leo in Leo-minster through the door? Oh, I don't know. Oh, poor Lizzie Darden, proper grown-up freelance Home Affairs journalist on hold, listening to me burble on about names of callers whose name is reflected in the first syllable of their location. Let's get back to the deep end with your help, Lizzie. We had a figure in the region of £700 million for... Whose fingerprints are on it most? Is it Suella Braverman's Rwanda plan? Is it Boris Johnson's Rwanda plan? Who if it was being disputed in court, who would have the greatest claim to ownership?
Good morning, James. If I was living in Cornwall, I'd say Liz in Lizard.
Yes, you sadly. See, it's easy. Well played.
Yeah, there you go. But yeah, no, in all seriousness, in terms of the fingerprints on the Rwanda scheme, because of the kind of Conservative government instability we had, several people have got responsibility, but they've also got plausible deniability because the core Conservative response to criticism of the Rwanda scheme at this stage and the money that was spent was that it wasn't done right. So I'm sure Priti Patel would say that if she had remained Home Secretary, then everything would have been fine. I'm sure Suella Braverman would say that if her vision had been realised, it would have been great. James Cleverly would say he was trying to make it work. And what we saw over time since the first deal was signed in April 2022 was that the scheme did go through several kind of evolutions where new agreements were signed, agreements were changed, assumptions changed, planning changed. And so the spending got wildly even more out of control than had been originally predicted because the scheme itself was changed so many times.
So there is a brilliant Rwanda scheme, but it goes to a different school, would be the contention of the politicians that you've just listed. It has a distinct whiff of Brexit to it, which is, I guess, inevitable given the characters and the cast that was responsible for trying to inflict it on the nation. So I had the figure of 700 million bubbling away somewhere in the back of my brain. That hasn't changed much.
No, it's gone up slightly. So 700 million was the figure that Yvette Cooper gave shortly after the election, after Labour announced that they were scrapping the scheme. Obviously, they were giving that figure as a kind of explanation or defence as to why they felt that stopping it would save more money than continuing it would save if it had the planned effect of deterring small boat crossings. But so the spending announced yesterday is now up to 715 million. That has gone out already. But to be clear, these are only what the government ranks as direct costs. This is what was quite literally transferred to Rwanda, spent on flights and planning and staffing and things that were absolutely directly on the scheme. This doesn't cover the cost of the wider impacts that the Rwanda scheme had on the UK asylum system. So the spending on asylum has gone up by several billion a year as a result of the law that was introduced to enforce the Rwanda scheme. And that is not counted in these figures.
Yes, I understand. And never will be, presumably.
No, it's very difficult to sort of split government spending to a certain degree, because the Home Office obviously exists as a body with staffing it's got. So it's quite difficult in the government's defence to decide exactly what every person was doing at one time and whether that should be counted as on Rwanda or on the wider scheme. And I think for that reason, this is probably about as much of a breakdown as we're going to get for the Rwanda scheme itself.
Just for the benefit of those at the back, why would the overall asylum bill have gone up by billions as a consequence of the Rwanda plan, whoever ultimately takes responsibility for it?
So originally, the Rwanda scheme wasn't created as a law. It was created as a deal between the UK and Rwanda. When the first legal challenge came and that paused the flights and put everything on the back burner, what the government did was create a new law, the Illegal Migration Act. And that came in under Suella Braverman, and the aim was to effectively bypass the Supreme Court ruling by creating a new legal duty on the government to send small boat migrants to Rwanda. And the aim of that law was the government would use the word operationalise Rwanda. That law, by accident or design, stopped the government processing tens of thousands of asylum claims because it banned them from granting leave to remain to people who had arrived here by small boat, which meant that they couldn't be granted refugee status. But also at that point, because of the ongoing Supreme Court battle, they couldn't send them to Rwanda. So that law created for the Rwanda scheme is what accelerated the massive asylum backlog we saw, which is what drove up spending on hotels and other costs and literally brought the asylum system to a halt.
So you could arrive here with a sworn affidavit from the head of the Taliban that if you showed your face in Kabul ever again, your head would be chopped off. And Suella Braverman introduced a law that would prevent you from even applying for refugee status if you'd arrived via one of these boats.
You could apply, but the government had barred the Home Office from granting refugee status and the leave to remain that comes with that to those people.
So the entire hotel phenomenon, or almost all of the hotel explosion, if you like, is entirely a consequence of Suella Braverman's political genius.
Since the Illegal Migration Act, that's what drove it up steeply. It should be said that before that, there were a lot of delays. Anyway, hotels had been used since COVID, but there was what was labelled at the time a perma backlog created by the Illegal Migration Act itself, yeah.
And it is the cost of that which would be added in an ideal universe to the £715 million that was actually spent. Cheques were signed, metaphorically speaking. Transfers were made. Money was handed over to people, to Rwanda, the Rwandan government, to airlines, to airfields, to police services, to detention and reception centres, and other fixed costs, totalling £715 million, for nothing, it has to be said. In the context of what the scheme was designed to do, it achieved nothing. Did anybody go against their will to Rwanda?
No one went against their will, no. In the last kind of evolution of the scheme, as discussed, in April, they changed it so that it could be a voluntary destination for people who had their asylum claims considered and been refused. So 4 failed asylum seekers, which was not the intention of the original scheme, did go voluntarily. The government did also have to pay for them. We're not sure exactly how much. Again, this isn't covered by those figures. But those were the only people who did travel to Rwanda in relation to this scheme.
And they were given money to go?
They were given £3,000 each as part of a pre-existing scheme, which is for any failed asylum seekers to facilitate their exit from the UK. But there was an agreement to give Rwanda up to 5 years of funding per person for various services and support in Rwanda. But the new agreement that facilitated that was never published. So at the moment, we don't know exactly how much that will cost.
Have you got an FOI in on that, Lizzie Darden, by any chance?
I might do, yeah.
We should watch this space with interest. So, I mean, what did anything jump out at you? Because this is the first time we've had a full breakdown of, well, not full, as you've alluded to, but you got £280 million under other fixed costs. I mean, it's a little lazy for me to wail, where has all the money gone? But where has all the money gone?
Yeah, so interestingly, that other fixed cost bracket, the government says it includes designing and developing digital IT and data systems to operationalise the deal, the cost of staff working directly on the policy, and also the big flag there is legal costs. We don't have a full breakdown of what they are, but they will be significantly into the millions, because as well as the sort of main Rwanda case that we talk about, which was the one that ended up at the Supreme Court, there were numerous individual challenges from people who were selected from the scheme that the government also decided to fight. And shortly before the general election, when the government started detaining people, they also faced a new wave of legal challenges there for people trying to get out. So I don't know the exact figures, but legal challenges will be a significant portion of that. And the other things are staff who were specifically counted as being on this scheme, and also the setup costs for various sort of administrative parts of the scheme, which are super boring but super expensive. It may be that we can get some more breakdown on that in future, but at the moment it's a bit of a mystery.
Absolutely extraordinary. Is there anything that a better interviewer would have asked you that I haven't?
No, this was great. I think one of the questions is future spending. We really don't know what is going to be spent on the volunteers who went there, and we're hoping that that's something we're going to be able to get more detail on.
Thank you, Lizzie Darden, freelance Home Affairs journalist, and I think she'd probably be embarrassed for me to describe her as, by some distance, the journalist doing the most important work in this field. Unless, of course, you don't care about £715 million being flushed down the toilet by Suella Braverman and Priti Patel and James Cleverly. Just absolutely extraordinary. Extraordinary. And in some newspapers today, I'm being told to get cross about Louise Hay getting a 16 grand or 17 grand settlement under the rules that have been in place in Parliament for ages. It's never nice. Liz Truss getting something after her tenure as Prime Minister seems remarkable. She gets it for life. But how can anyone who calls themselves a journalist not be screaming this £715 million figure at every single member of Kemi Badenoch's front bench, because they were all full square behind this ludicrous plan. All of them, I think. Well, James Cleverly apparently privately called it a word I don't... Well, Eleanor doesn't like me saying that word on the radio, even though Michelle Hussein said it on the Today programme 6 times in one interview. But the stuff that comes out of a bat's bottom, James Cleverly reportedly called it that privately, but by the time he was in the Foreign Office, he was singing its benefits from the rafters. And there it is. So that's why we use the phrase client journalism, because they won't be talking about that anytime soon. 11:02. And here's a question for you. If £22 billion is a fiscal black hole, how much is 715? And let's call it around billion. But I mean, that's generous by the time you factored in the costs of the consequences of the Illegal Migration Act. So if £22 billion is a fiscal black hole, what did the Tories create deliberately? What did they dig? What would we call that? A fiscal what? You can text 84850. It's 11:02.
James O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes after 11, Chris suggests a fiscal latrine, a fiscal plug hole, says Zach in West Hampstead. It sounds like a fiscal cesspit, says Tom. A fiscal carbuncle, says John in Edinburgh. We quite like that. It's a supermassive black hole. Scientists are pretty logical when naming things. It can't be that, Joe, in Liverpool, because £22 billion is a fiscal black hole. So what is the £1 billion, give or take, with some change that Braverman and the rest of them spent on a Rwanda scheme that did precisely nothing when you factor in what it was actually designed to do? Guano, Frank says, from Frankfurt. Are you actually in Frankfurt, Frank? I know your name is Frank. Frank in Frankfurt would get onto my final show on LBC when every single caller has to have a name that is repeated in the first syllable of wherever it is they're calling from. And maybe I need to change the rule for first syllable. Some people still not getting it. No offence, Dina, but I can't make it any simpler. Chesney from Cheltenham would not get in. Colin from Colchester would not get in. Col from Colchester would. But whether or not Colin from Colindale would make the cut, I haven't actually decided yet. Shirley, that's quite nice. It also has the best named Chinese restaurant in the country. This is actually true. The Shirley Temple. That's from Andy in Brighton. And in Ando. Anyway, 7 after 11 is the time. So I'm making you do all the work today. That's not really true, is it? But it sometimes seems that way. Do you know who Tom Hayhoe is? Can you hear the name Hayhoe without thinking of the former England cricketer Rachel Hayhoe-Flint? I can't. That might be my age. Tom Hayhoe. Do you know who Tom Hayhoe is? Anybody? Tom Hayhoe? Hayhoe. Hey, well, guess what? It's off to work he goes today, because Tom Hayhoe is the new COVID corruption commissioner, and he starts work today, effectively. Why did no one else spot that headline? Hey ho, it's off to work he goes. No, you're not. I think that's great. The first task he's got is reviewing the entire £8.7 billion worth of PPE that was bought during the pandemic that then had to be written off the government's books. £8.7 billion of PPE written off the government's books. He's also going to be looking at the £674 million of deals that the last government abandoned attempts to reclaim. But Louise Hay got a 17 grand severance package when she stepped down as Transport Secretary. So Rishi Sunak, I think, took a decision to call time on an investigation or an attempt to reclaim £674 million. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's absolute peanuts compared to what they spent on sending nobody to Rwanda. But £674 million was just the beginning. It was the nibbling at the edges of this issue. The National Crime Agency continues to investigate possible criminal offences committed in the PPE procurement system. But Rachel Reeves has charged Tom Hayhoe, it's off to work he goes, with trying to recover the public money lost to fraud and to underperforming contracts, using his experience in procurement as the former chair of an NHS trust. I think this story is huge. Some people think that Louise Haig's contract is a bigger story than this. I think this is the biggest domestic story in town today, with the possible exception of the £715 million they spaffed up the wall on a Rwanda scheme that sent precisely nobody to Rwanda. Because we talked about this a lot at the time. Department of Health and Social Care lost 3/4 of the £12 billion it spent on PPE in the first year of the pandemic, largely due to inflated prices and kit that did not meet requirements. One prominent company that was awarded PPE contracts worth more than £200 million through a so-called VIP lane was called PPE MedPro, which you will remember was linked to Michelle Mone, who was put in the House of Lords by, I think, David Cameron, and who for a very long time denied that either her or her husband had anything at all to do with that business. So I'm never more naive than when it comes to profiteering. I'm a great fan of the word enough. I did a lovely full disclosure recently with Rob Brydon, who is, I mean, I hesitate to say it, he is every bit as lovely in person as you would expect him to be from familiarity with his work. He's an absolutely lovely, lovely man. And he sometimes gets a bit of stick from his mate, Steve Coogan, for not pursuing the big Hollywood projects that Steve Coogan now pursues with great success. And Rob Brydon talked to me about the concept of having enough. And I think that possibly underpins some of my naivety when it comes to profiteering. If you've already got £10 million, if you've already got £100 million, if you're Elon Musk, how can you not have enough? I think this is arguably the most fascinating psychological facet of humanity. I think it explains almost everything throughout history. Henry VIII hadn't got enough, so he dissolved the monasteries. You haven't got enough. You're never going to have enough. The single most important thing you can achieve in life is a sense of having enough. Some people who've got next to nothing have enough. I don't want to engage in any sort of schmaltzy, lazy stereotyping, but you always read about people living incredibly simple lives, but being happier than those of us that live more complicated lives. The producer has picked me up on, she thinks I'm being unfair to Henry VIII. I was talking about his money. I wasn't talking about his lack of an heir. He didn't dissolve the monasteries because he thought it would help him get an heir. He dissolved the monasteries because Thomas Cromwell advised him, quite correctly, that he would absolutely jackpot his way all the way to the bank and back if he nicked all the money from the Catholic Church. So enough. You are way ahead of me, Mohit. You say I've knitted the Rwanda and the PPE scandal together. I was tempted to do it both ways round and do a really lazy phone in and just say, where has all the money gone? The Rwanda money and the PPE money. But I don't want to do that because I don't think we know the answer to the first question yet. But on the PPE question, the amount that was unfit for purpose, the amount that ended up being burned, we actually ended up paying private companies to burn PPE that other private companies had been paid for when the genius that is Dominic Cummings was running the show in Downing Street. I use the word naivety and focus on the word enough because I don't get this. Maybe I'm an idiot. Maybe I'd be different if I'd been raised differently or if my own financial situation was a bit different. But Carol Vorderman and I bonded over the realisation that when the country faced its Armageddon with regard to COVID, when the reality of what this coronavirus was going to mean for the country became clear, our impulse would be to ask what I can do for help. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Even having watched the liars and the charlatans of Brexit, even having watched Boris Johnson make his way all the way to number 10 Downing Street, even having witnessed all of the corruptions of Donald Trump's first administration, I still thought that was normal. I still thought that was the default position. I know what you're thinking. You're saying, James, what about that famous quote from Balzac or Tolstoy that you often remind us of without being able to remember who actually said it, that behind every great fortune there is a great crime? And you're right. I do say that out loud, but I don't really believe it. Not every single great fortune. But when the alarm bells started ringing, a huge number of people, almost all of whom were very adjacent to the Conservative Party, did not ask, what can I do to help? They ask, how can I make money out of this? How can I make money out of this? And we would take calls, wouldn't we, from people who wanted to help. People, I always remember the woman who had not quite a warehouse. I think she had about a dozen ventilators. They were in the business of exporting ventilators. She couldn't get her phone answered in Whitehall, in Westminster. She just wanted to hand them over. She may have wanted paying cost for them. People were doing stuff for cost. Remember we spoke to the lad who'd set up his own hand sanitizer production line. And he might have made a few quid. But enormous numbers of people were doing stuff for nothing. My friend Bella started making PPE, actually making PPE, but she's a fashion designer. So she had the equipment and had the mountains she had to climb to get it into the hands of medical professionals, while Tory party VIPs, people that managed to call in a favour or get themselves on this VIP lane, they were getting substandard PPE into hospitals, stuff so unfit for purpose they ended up having to set fire to it. Didn't a lorry arrive from Turkey at one point, and then when they opened it, it was all rubbish, but the fella still got paid? So what's the topic? Ted in Teddington's been in touch. Hello, Ted. You can come on the retirement show. What is the topic? What is the question here? Where has all the money gone? Or how feasible is it that Tom Hayhoe will be able to claw some of it back? What I want to do is almost resurrect some conversations that we had back in the day. There's a huge temptation never to return to those dread days for obvious reasons. And you know, many of us didn't even lose a family member or a close friend. But what do you know? So this is a really, really open goal, okay? Because you might be a nurse that actually got given stuff that you're pretty sure someone else was being paid for, but was not fit for purpose. What is your story of this scandal? £8.7 billion of PPE written off the government's books. There will be fraud involved. There will be epic, utterly unconscionable instances of greed. What set your alarm bells ringing back in the day, whether it's a tiny little thing, or massive? Remind me, calls that you made to me at the time. Because I don't know why I keep mentioning Carol Vorderman. I think it's because I felt so reassured when she essentially said what I had been thinking all along. How can anybody have greeted the arrival of coronavirus in this island as a business opportunity when doctors and nurses were risking their lives to look after us? When people were suffering in the most awful fashions? Everything. We were thinking of putting patients in car parks, those ludicrous Nightingale hospitals. So much. And yet, the kind of people who've got Michael Gove on speed dial, they were sitting there thinking, how can we make a few £1 million out of this? Old boy, old fruit, me old china, me old spoons. So, what is it that you remember most? When Tom Hayhoe starts work today going after money that should never have made its way into the pockets of people, most of whom were Tory party friends, donors, supporters. What do you think of first? What is the best example you have? What should Tom Hayhoe be looking at? It can't be libelous, so be a little bit cautious. But what do you think he should be going after? And then if you want, you can also have a crack at where did all the money go? 0345 6060973. So what would you like to bring to Tom Hayhoe's attention? Big or small? And if you're feeling very cocky this morning, where did all the money go?
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 21 minutes after 11. I can't think of a bigger story, really, in the context of looking down the road ahead. If you're looking in the rearview mirror, you've got the Rwanda story and the report that I don't think you've heard anywhere else today, the final breakdown of how they managed to waste £715 million on, quotes, deporting, end quotes, precisely nobody to Rwanda. But looking in the rearview mirror and at the road ahead, we find Tom Hayhoe, the COVID Corruption Commissioner, starting an investigation today into PPE fraud. And I wonder what you would like him to look at. No names, obviously, for legal reasons, but the stuff you endured, the stuff you witnessed, whether as a patient or a nurse, a practitioner or a recipient, the stuff you witnessed that means there are huge investigations to be undertaken here. There are huge jobs to be done. And there was absolutely no chance whatsoever of them being done under the last government. So the question of whether or not this fella is going to be able to land any of the £8 billion spent on PPE that got lost in the first round of COVID. That's from the Department of Health and Social Care. Civil servant who presided over DHSC during the pandemic, by the way, has just been made the most senior civil servant in the country. He's just been made cabinet secretary. But I know the plural of anecdote is not data, and we're not doing that today. Today we're just literally saying what happened to you that makes you realise how important Tom Hayhoe's job is. 22 minutes after 11 is the time. Alicia is in Bath. Alicia, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'm the lady regarding the ventilators we spoke several months ago, where we have had ventilators in the country during the sort of beginning of the pandemic.
Several years ago, Alicia.
Was it really?
Yeah, well, of course it was. You know, it was when the coronavirus was in full flow. I remember it well. I just talked about you, as you know.
So what I would recommend this chap to investigate is where the ventilators that were purchased, because they certainly weren't ours and others in the country that have, reputable ventilators that were being used at the time. They've come from very unusual, unheard of Chinese companies that were purchased in cash for hugely inflated prices. I'm talking 10 times more than what you would normally pay for a ventilator, and they were turning up in bits to various NHS hospitals, often with missing components, so you couldn't even use them anyway. And I saw this firsthand because I go into these clinical engineering departments, and they were there with great big signs on "do not use," unfit for purpose, and all of that kind of stuff. So we've paid so much money for ventilators that we were never able to use in the first place, and they've come from overseas.
And we know this happened with PPE, people who had no experience in that field whatsoever, but got on touch with someone in Whitehall and said, "Oh, I've got contacts. I've got great contacts. I've not got any business experience in this field whatsoever, but I've got great contacts. I can get you some ventilators from China."
Yeah.
I think the one area that is perhaps excusable from their end of the phone, from the Whitehall end of the phone, is that they were panicking. And I
can appreciate that, but when we spoke to them, they said, "Yeah, send us a spec," which we did because we were already in business.
Yes.
You know, it's a very reputable company, 40 years old, and they said, "Yeah, send us a spec," and then we never heard back.
I remember.
And they were here in the country, in Reading.
Because you didn't have any VIP access or you didn't have any politicians on speed dial, so you just sort of ended up phoning a switchboard, almost, essentially.
Well, yeah, I mean, to even get through to speak to someone was just, you know, a bit of a nightmare.
But they should have been phoning you. I remember saying this at the time. I mean, how hard would it have been to find you?
Well, just a Google search would have been...
The galaxy brain
enough.
that is Dominic Cummings could have said, "Get every single person in this country that's ever sold a ventilator and get them for me now."
Exactly. And it's just a massively inflated... I mean, a normal ventilator, like a run-of-the-mill NHS ventilator, will cost somewhere between £20,000 and £30,000.
Right.
And they're buying them from China, from unknown companies we've never heard of before, for 200,000 each.
And this became a big topic of conversation in your sector, presumably.
It did, and when this report came out, it literally lists them, how many they bought. And usually, you know, we get an invoice when we've delivered equipment. This was upfront cash payment to these companies.
It's mad, isn't it? And
it's bonkers, and it's so corrupt.
Well, it looks that way, and that's why he is called the COVID Corruption Commissioner. And
I really hope he does his job well, because I'll be rooting for him.
Well, I will as well. I think every patriot will be. But the killer question is, how optimistic are we, do you think?
We've got to have hope, James.
Got to have hope, Joanna. I know your name is Alicia, but that's a Kool and the Gang song from my childhood that you're almost certainly too young to remember. Alicia, wow, great that you're still listening. I haven't scared you off yet. And also that you heard me referring to your story. So I slightly misremembered. You did get through, but only in the way that any ordinary member of the public would get through. And just send us the specs of your ventilators you've got. And then you're on the next phone line dialing out saying, hello, Humphrey? Yeah, you know those ventilators you told me you could get hold of in China for 10 times more than this lady in Bath is offering? Yes, could you send them all over? The check's in the post. It is about as close to untrammelled corruption as it's possible to imagine, perhaps. Bhavesh is in Harrow. Bhavesh, what made you pick up the phone?
Tom, I'm not that optimistic about Tom doing all this.
You are or you're not?
I'm not.
No,
I'm not.
Eddie Grant. It was Eddie Grant, not Kool in the Gang. I apologise.
Eddie Grant. You're talking from my times of music as well.
There you go. Give me hope, Joanna. Carry on, Bhavesh.
Well, look, with all this, there's a paper trail somewhere, right? There's got to be a paper trail, right?
Yes.
So quotations, tendering, purchase orders, payments, there's a paper trail somewhere.
Yes.
Now, all the PPE kit that's come in, whatever standard it is, if it's substandard, they've burnt it. They've destroyed it.
Right. Yes, but they've destroyed it because it was substandard, so the paper trail would still exist. They haven't destroyed the evidence because the evidence would be the reason for burning it.
That's right, but in terms of fraud, how do we know the stuff that's... If they've ordered some medical gloves...
I bought it in good faith. I bought it in good faith and I sold it in good faith, my lud. That's what you're saying.
Why burn it? Why burn it?
Yeah.
If it was good enough, why have you burnt it? I think, it's going to be the paper trail's there, but to prove that's fraud is going to be difficult. And I don't think Tom can go back and say...
We're calling him Tom. Do you know him?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
No, I like it. I like the way this show is such a friendly and familiar place. He's calling old Tom now. Oh, good old Tom. Good luck to you, Tom. More power to your elbow, Tom. Go, Tom. Hey ho.
But it's just it's going to be very hard to prove that this was fraud. Is all I'm saying.
And I wonder how long it'll be before the Daily Mail runs a story about how much the investigation is costing.
Exactly, but it's also a contract that I've heard from the previous government. So these guys can't say that contracts, if they've signed a contract, yeah?
Yes.
So what do you do?
I don't know.
It's all about what?
Yeah, but you've got to have hope, Joanna.
Well, you've got to have, exactly.
You've got to have hope. And they should definitely do it, but I don't know whether we're just a nation battered into cynicism and scepticism by recent experiences. I don't know whether the right man for the job is... I know he's a mate of yours, Bhavesh, old Tom, but I don't know if the right man for the job is a former procurement head at an NHS trust as opposed to a member of the Serious Fraud Office. Maybe it is a better idea, actually, because of the paper trail that Bhavesh describes. It will be his bread and butter in a previous existence. Thank you. Phone lines are open, 0345 6060 973. I liked Alicia's call. I like Bhavesh's call as well. But what Alicia's call did was answer the question I should have asked you, which is, how do you know that there's fraud? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. How do you know that there's fraud? 0345 6060 973. Things that, how do you know, should be on Tom Hayhoe's to-do list? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. Thomas Watts is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11, Dan says, I'm shocked, James, that as someone from Worcestershire, you've not thought of Eve from Evesham. Eve from Evesham, all day long. I love it. Unlawful. Big word, isn't it? The government's operation of a VIP lane for suppliers of personal protective equipment during the coronavirus pandemic was illegal, or unlawful, if you prefer. The High Court judge has ruled. Another judge ruled last week that when Kemi Badenoch withdrew a grant from the Irish rap group Kneecap, that was unlawful. She described the government's decision not to appeal it as unbelievable because it would cost so much money to give them the grant. I don't know whether or not we need to submit a Freedom of Information request for this, but I'm fairly confident that fighting a legal battle like that would cost more than the $12,500 grant that Kneecap got in the first place. But I must be wrong because Kemi Badenoch doesn't do gaffes, remember? She never has to apologise or clarify anything she's ever said. How do we know that? Because she told us in a gaffe. So I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe going to the law on a case like that is considerably cheaper than I've always been led to believe. So that was unlawful. What else was unlawful? The prorogation of Parliament was unlawful, wasn't it? What have those three things got in common? The VIP lane for suppliers of personal protective equipment, Kemi Badenoch's attempt to strip an Irish rap group of a small cultural grant, and the prorogation of Parliament. Three unlawful acts. What have they all got in common? Yeah. But did I ever tell you about Keir Starmer's football ticket? Let's get back to the corruption, the PPE, the fraud, and the likelihood of Tom Hayhoe, who we all feel we know now. We should try and get him in, actually. It should be a good interview, would he, Tom Hayhoe? I think he would. Don't want to big him up too much. The likelihood of Tom Hayhoe getting some results, getting some scalps, getting some cash back. Rob's in Stockport. Rob, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. You okay?
I'm all good, Rob. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I'm going to have to change my name to Stop just to get into your final show.
I was just thinking that, and then I thought, no, that doesn't really work. But you went there anyway, and I'm glad that you did. Stop, Rob, Stop. Rob, Stop. It's your own personal music festival. What's on your mind?
Absolutely. What it is, I mean, it's regarding the question of where the money went. I worked for a recruitment company, and we were paid by the government. The government don't procure their own staff. They go out to several recruitment firms in the private sector and ask recruitment companies to fill roles. So we did test and trace.
Hang on, surely that's sandwich companies.
I'm not going to mention the name because
fair enough.
I was made redundant in July, so they're not getting any free advertising.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, so they would. So a lot of the money went on recruitment.
Yes. And how much of that would be skimmed off the top, as opposed to making its way into the pockets of the people that were supposed to be doing the actual work? Although we'll get onto that later.
Well, I mean, it's a long line. Obviously, the firm that I worked for had to make money off the bat.
Of course.
So there was. I wouldn't call it profiteering, but there was a big markup on what we would normally charge from when a government contract came in.
Oh, really? So even so you knew what the going rate was for that kind of work.
Yeah.
But COVID focused the mind, and this company responded by increasing the commission.
Yeah, and also because candidates were working for the government, they had to go through government screening.
Yeah.
So we could have everything in place for that person to be sat there doing the job, but it could take 2 months for the actual government to do the screening to say, yes, that person can have access to our systems.
Oh, wow.
But we were paying them whilst they were sat there doing nothing.
And even after they got hired, this was the closest I got to a scoop in a very long time, Rob, when we actually took calls one day by accident. I can't remember what question I'd actually asked, but people who'd started work for Test and Trace at home who were just sitting staring at their laptops for hours on end and doing we couldn't believe it. And then the phones went boom. And there were people queuing up. Obviously, they didn't have anything else to do. There were people queuing up to tell us that they were...
I know, and also just to knit things together, once the Test and Trace system stopped, we were moved to recruit for the Home Office for asylum.
Really? Good Lord. Cry out of the frying pan into the fire. So you are personally responsible for about 50 billion pounds worth of fiscal black hole. What... I'll take that hit. I'm all right. The problem is that you've not described fraud. You've described scalping or salami slicing or ramping up. You're doing what Oasis did with that. Was in your neck of the woods. So Oasis tickets go up according to demand. Everyone has a hissy fit about it.
Yeah.
What the government is paying to recruit Test and Trace goes up, not according to demand, but just because of the desperation, and everybody just waves it through.
Yeah, and like I say, no, of course it's not fraud in that sense, but I knew that we were charging way over the odds for what we would normally charge.
Can I ask you a personal question?
Yes.
Does that make you feel a bit stupid? Because you balk at that, right? You balk at what you've described. You can't quite... You can understand how if, you've got two people bidding for the same car and they want to push each other to silly new heights, then you crack on, lads, fill your boots. But if you're dealing in a national crisis like this, and the people running your outfit and all of the other people whose names we're familiar with...
I got the role during COVID.
Right.
It was work from home, and I had bills to pay, James.
No, I don't mean that. I mean, does it make you feel a bit stupid that you are surprised by what the people upstairs were doing? They're surprised, because I sit here and think, how could anybody have...
Of course, that sits with me. Yeah,
we're so naive, thinking that the boss would actually turn down the commission. I'll tell you what, this is a time of national crisis. It's like war. And then, of course, enormous fortunes are made during war. Nobody says, we're going to war. I'm going to reduce the price of bombs because I'm patriotic.
It did. It did. It was like, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
What, we're charging that?
Yeah.
We can get that off the government? What?
Yeah. Or maybe it's a left-right thing. I don't want to be rude. I'm not unintentionally, as you know, Rob. I'm more than happy being intentionally rude. But maybe it breaks left-right, does it? If you're left-wing, then profit is not everything. You recognise the importance of capitalism. But at times like this, if you ran a PPE company, you'd offer the government a break. I wonder how... Rob, thank you, mate. Stay safe. Don't change your name to Stock. How stupid do I sound? I wonder how it breaks down. Sometimes I wish we could do a thing where we had buttons, like in a TV studio, like red and green. How stupid do I sound when I say I honestly thought that big companies in a position to help would have, at the very least, kept their prices the same. At the very least. But possibly reduce them slightly as well. For the government contracts, for the helping the NHS, for the supporting of the population, I wonder how it breaks down. Do you think it would be 52-48? The infernal ratio, not a million miles away from what's happened in the United States election, where some people think greed is absolutely natural and normal, and some people think that it's an enormous obstacle to harmony in society. Untrammeled greed. You need a bit of greed. You go nowhere without some greed. No one would ever get out of bed. But how naive does it sound to you? I'm fascinated by the psychology of it. I really am. Lisa's being very clever today. She says, you profited during COVID, James. How do you feel? Well, I mean, I got paid for doing the job that I always do, but I lost money in terms of doing other jobs and being able to do other things. But even if I hadn't, it's not that I worked for the government. I never know whether I need to explain stuff like this or whether people like Lisa are being sort of performatively thick. I don't work for the government. I didn't increase my fees at any cost to the taxpayer, and my work, and I agree with you that this is quite miraculous, was never found to be unfit for purpose. So to try to draw a parallel between me and the kind of people that were shipping in unusable ventilators at inflated costs or providing PPE that couldn't be used and ended up being burned is an exercise in quite extraordinary idiocy, Lisa, that leaves me fairly confident as to how you vote in referendums and elections. And it's a crucial part of the problem, because if you're not very bright and not very wealthy, they need your support. They need people like Lisa to wave their little flags going, "Yay, I'm with them," even as they rob me blind. Because that lot over there complaining about me being robbed blind, they're as bad as the actual robbers. Yeah, you bet you profited, didn't you, eh? Which translates as, I bet you got paid for doing your job. As opposed to, did you really increase your costs, increase your prices, knowingly provide substandard? If you don't know the difference between a contract of employment and criminal fraud, then I genuinely don't know that I can help. Martin's in Ilchester, which has set me wondering, but there isn't anyone called Ilch, is there? Martindale. Is there a Martindale?
Martin Beard.
Martin Beard. Where's that? No, not you, Martin. I mean, no. a town that's got... Is there Martin Chester? Ilchester? I know. Ilchester. What's on your mind, Martin, in Ilchester?
Bit nervous.
It's only me, and I probably shouldn't have introduced you in such a confusing fashion if you're nervous. So let's pretend that never happened.
Okay. 2016. I'll give you a little put into history. 2016, I spent a year in hospital in Oxford. So when COVID hit, I'd got back on my feet and I was running this engineering business I owned, and we made parts for people like the European Space Station. So I knew I could make ventilator parts without question. 3 times online tried to offer free of charge 50% of my production lines to making parts. Never got a response. In the end, I sponsored 4 3D printers, and when it was all over, gave 2 of them to charity. And we were making face shields.
Right.
And I supplied district nurses, GPs in Buckinghamshire where we lived, emergency dentists, care homes, and they were free. We gave them.
Why?
So,
why did you do it?
Because they saved my life, the NHS. And after you spend a year in a hospital bed, you got to pay back. So I got in touch with the NHS, which were based in Liverpool, the office, I think it was, and we were producing 500 a week, and we were said, right, where do you want them? We'll give them, we'll deliver them, we'll just rock up. And we didn't suffer from lockdown because we were making military and medical equipment anyway.
So you stayed open throughout?
So we stayed open, yeah.
But you handed over some of your capacity and therefore some of your
and it was never taken up.
Why not?
Took up.
Why not?
No one contacted us and came back to us, and in the end...
They didn't understand the language you were speaking, Martin. You were speaking the language of decency, altruism and patriotism. Might as well have been Mandarin as far as Boris Johnson was concerned.
Yeah. One of them said to me in the NHS office, when I said they're free, we'll deliver you 500 a week minimum, where do you want them? And they said, sorry, we don't really understand the system, free. And I couldn't believe it. I laughed my socks off. In the end, some big restaurant chains also started taking them from us, and we gave them to them something like about a 50p over cost to the materials, so we could keep manufacturing. And after that, our accountants drew up all the figures, and we bought wheelchairs, iPads, and supplied them all to the upper GI ward in Churchill Hospital in Oxford.
Where you'd been?
Yeah.
I mean, there it is. Which bit of the story do you find hardest to swallow even now?
Another company that we had dealings with, he was doing similar, and he was turning up in car parks and telling the nurses, I've got boxes of shields here, and the nurses would come down from the wards and take them from the back of the van. And I find when you hear Hancock ring fencing care homes, and they're just lies. It's not true.
Is there any way we can process what you've just described generously? Because no one, I mean, I guess the naivety of the procurers, the public servants, the civil servants, whether through desperation or naivety, not realising profiteering would be going on an industrial scale because they'd led relatively sheltered lives, perhaps. I don't know. I'm just sort of spitballing. And then the inability to quite believe you maybe seemed to them too good to be true. But I think there's more people like you around than some people like to admit.
Right, yeah. I must have a little plug, if that's okay.
Of course you must. I was about to invite you to.
Chalfont St Peter, scouts in the village.
Yeah. I thought you were going to plug your business.
I was chairman, and 4 or 5 of them helped a little production line assembling them and boxing them for me.
Came in.
But I sold the business up after Brexit. I bought stuff for engineering, couldn't get materials, couldn't get staff.
No.
He's my favourite.
And now we can't even get a clear phone line to Ilchester, but luckily we managed to get the full story out, including a little shout out for the who else thought he was going to a Chalfont St Peter Scout group who stepped up to the plate? Dear. You tell you what, Godspeed, Tom Hayhoe. And I normally find anybody who uses the word Godspeed to be an irredeemable flump, but that fits. A lot of love for you coming in, Martin, and frankly, you deserve every single drop of it.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 11:52. That chap just melted my heart. It makes me furious thinking of the same people that were profiteering, were the ones encouraging idiots to stand outside and clap every Thursday. Come on, Ross, we were all standing outside and clapping every Thursday. But yeah, man alive. Look over here, everyone hitting saucepans with wooden spoons. Don't look over there at all the Tory donors making hundreds of millions of pounds from a national crisis. And the naivety really kicks in when you think about war. That only just stop me in my tracks. Because, of course, I mean, what does history teach us? You've got war, but you've got arms dealers selling arms to both sides in wars. And then we all sit here. Oh, I don't know. Happily, Aggie Chambre is here with a political exclusive to distract us from the Tom Hayhoe's first task of reviewing the £8.7 billion worth of PPE bought during the pandemic that then had to be written off the government books. You add that to the Rwanda, you've got half the fiscal black hole right there. And that's just the stuff we know about. Aggie, what have you got?
So, James, Labour has called for Reform UK to be investigated by Parliament's standard watchdog after we revealed last week that the party's latest recruit, Dame Andrea Jenkyns, who joined Reform last week, she accused...
Did we find anyone in the Conservative Party who was sorry to see her go?
No, and in fact, I spoke to the Conservatives and they said, we wish her the best with her new friends. Yeah. But on election night, Andrea Jenkyns told LBC, it was just after she'd lost her seat as an MP, and she said to LBC, well, I've been accused of a bribe, of bribing a Reform candidate, but actually they tried to bribe me with an £80,000 job. So this is what she said on election night.
One of their party donors who tried to bribe me with an 80 grand job. And as you'll also see in the public domain, they tried to do with Lee Anderson, and there's also another Conservative former MP they're trying to do as well. So I hate lies. I am a straight-talking Yorkshire woman, and I hate lies.
So hang on a minute. She's a straight-talking Yorkshire woman who hates lies, but got made a dame by Boris Johnson.
Yes.
Well, riddle me that, lads. Riddle me that. So it was a Tory. It was a donor to the Reform Party.
Yeah.
That she claimed had offered her an 80 grand job
to join
them and ditch the Tories earlier in the year.
Indeed.
Oh.
And so, she said at the time, well, I didn't do that. I didn't want to do that. But obviously last week she did go and do that. So we played out this audio. We asked her about it on air and she didn't deny it. So this is what she said when we asked her about the fact that, she'd just joined Reform. But hang on, wasn't she offered a bribe, in her words, to join Reform?
What had happened was it was actually one of the candidates who was standing against me who was, causing a lot of hassle. But let's face it, political parties during an election, they fall out. And I've joined them because, I worked with Richard Tice and Nigel Farage for 6 years during the Brexit days. I was there on his march for Brexit, etc. And, I know that they are the guys who are on the same page as me, hence why I've joined them.
What? She sounded a bit like the person who described herself as a straight-talking Yorkshire woman. In that clip. Can we listen to the first clip again? Because I'm sure that's the same person claiming that she's a straight-talking Yorkshire woman and then just sort of saying some words in a salad-type formation.
One of their party donors who tried to bribe me with an 80 grand job. And as you'll also see in the public domain, they tried to do with Lee Anderson, and there's also another Conservative former MP they're trying to do as well. So I hate lies. I am a straight-talking Yorkshire woman, and I hate lies.
I hate lies. I am a straight-talking Yorkshire woman who got made a dame by Boris Johnson, and this is the same person doing some straight-talking Yorkshire womaning.
What had happened was it was actually one of the candidates who was standing against me who was, causing a lot of hassle. But let's face it, political parties during an election, they fall out. And I've joined them because, I worked with Richard Tice and Nigel Farage for 6 years during the Brexit days. I was there on his march for Brexit, etc. And, I know that they are the guys who are on the same page as me, hence why I've joined them.
Did the second woman kidnap the straight-talking Yorkshire woman, or is that the same woman?
All the facts I have available to me at this stage suggest it is the same woman.
It couldn't have been a doppelganger that came in.
I don't think so.
How extraordinary.
But Labour are now asking for Parliament's standard watchdog, a guy called Daniel Greenberg, to investigate this. And what's weird, James, is this isn't the first letter that Ellie Reeves, who's the chair of the Labour Party, has sent to Daniel Greenberg about these so-called bribes from Reform. In fact...
So-called by a straight-talking Yorkshire woman who is now a member of Reform.
In her words, bribes. Yes. So in fact, earlier in the year, Lee Anderson said... confusing. When he was a Conservative MP, said that he had been offered an £80,000 job by Reform before he joined Reform. Now, Reform at the time said that was just lies, it wasn't true, but that's what he said. He then, of course, became a Reform MP. So Labour last week had already written to Daniel Greenberg and said, hang on, you need to look into this. They've said economic enticement should have no place at all in UK politics. And then I went to them and said, well, how about this audio? So then they've sent a second letter to Daniel Greenberg. We don't know yet whether he's going to investigate, but he has these two letters. He's got the audio, and they quoted her responding, that second clip that we've heard a couple of times now, in that letter. But, all a bit confusing. They haven't come back to me on this. They did come back to me.
Is it confusing?
I'm confused.
It is very confusing. Let me predict that you haven't had any response at all from Reform?
Not on this. Last week they did come back to me and said we refute any allegations of so-called bribes. Andrea joined the party because she believes in Reform and wants to help save the country. But when I asked them about this letter, and I asked Andrea Jenkins too about the letter, I didn't get any response.
So they're denying it all. So they are effectively calling the straight-talking Yorkshire woman Andrea Jenkins a liar.
They are on the bribe thing, yeah. Absolutely, yes.
Well, this gets more and more interesting. And I have in the past, you probably don't know this, I've been fairly critical of Nigel Farage.
I had no idea.
But you can say one thing about the man. When he is held accountable for the behaviour of his MPs or his members or his prominent people, they've called a whole press conference to announce this person, then he does always respond very maturely, very honestly and very fairly, demonstrating at all times a commitment to sort of probity and integrity and the importance of accountability. Because he was asked just last week, of course, about details emerging that suggested one of his own MPs, James Murdoch, had not only kicked 7 bells out of a defenceless young woman and been locked up for it, but also subsequently lied about it.
It involves being honest, though. Are you not concerned that he lied about what he did?
Did he? He wasn't vetted. He wasn't vetted. James McMurdoch was one of those many candidates who wasn't vetted at all with the party. Look, I didn't know any of this when I took back over as leader.
So you said you're going to put in place the most vigorous vetting system in place now. Do you think James McMurdoch would not go through this new vetting system?
You can have your fun at Sky News. We've got 100,000 members. I've got 1 million followers on TikTok. Dame Andrea Jenkins has just joined us. She's our candidate for Greater Lincolnshire. You've had your fun. I'm off for lunch. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I must have misremembered that exercise in accountability, transparency, honesty and commitment to probity. But that's the man, ultimately, who will be charged with deciding whether or not to respond to the story that you've just knitted together for us, Aggie.
Well, fortunately, perhaps, although I'm not suggesting that Nigel Farage wouldn't be able to respond adequately to it, the Parliament Standard Watchdog Daniel Greenberg might actually investigate this, especially because there's 2 different cases of it, and then that will be taken out of Reform UK's hands. We shall see. I haven't checked, but I imagine he's on Question Time this week, is he? Or next week, so no doubt someone will be able to put these to him in person. Aggie Chambre, many thanks. It's 12:01.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 4 minutes after 12. Julian writes, I wish you'd give a sarcasm warning, James. Maybe a noise or something, a sound effect. I totally fell for your praise for Farage a moment ago as being someone who valued professionalism, etc. Julian, if you need a sarcasm alert for anybody describing Nigel Farage in glowing terms regarding integrity, probity, accountability and the rest of it, then I actually, by an extraordinary coincidence, I have a bridge that you might be interested in buying. I'll be posting you the details after the programme today. 5 minutes after 12 is the time. I really like this issue, but I want to make it clear from the start that it is not about the Parthenon Marbles. Do you know, even the fact that we call them the Elgin Marbles explains why I love this story. And oddly, given that we've just been unfortunately exposed to a distinct whiff of the Farage, there's a Brexit element to this. Because I am intrigued by exceptionalism. Lots of countries have had empires. I could now go a little bit Partridge and start listing them. But, you know, most obviously, the Romans had an empire. The Portuguese Empire was huge. The Belgian Empire was immense. A Spanish Empire, as you know. Many European countries, the French had an empire. The Ottomans had a huge empire. Most European countries have had empires at some point. I suppose ours is the most recent, maybe, and one of the biggest, but not even the biggest. But I'm fascinated by exceptionalism. The reason I mention Brexit is because of that crazy window we got into the minds of people like David Davis and hard man of Brexit, Steve Baker and Mark Francois and Digby Pudding Jones. Do you remember him? And all of these people seem to think that we would be able to defy gravity by dint of being British. That's a fair comment, right? And you may well have felt that as well. You may still feel that. I don't mean to insult you. You have this sort of sense that because we're British, we will not have to play by the rules that Johnny Foreigner has to play by. So, for example, we can leave the European Union and still enjoy all the benefits of membership of the European Union, which lots of people argued and apparently genuinely believed, including the penny farthing in human form, Jacob Rees-Mogg. They genuinely seem to think that by dint of being British, some intangible but inalienable characteristic, they would not just receive special treatment, but they would deserve it by divine right, at risk of knitting everything together, which is a growing temptation as I get older. At risk of knitting everything together, this is also how people like Henry VIII can rip a country off and still get cheered to the rafters if he decides to take a caravan trip to York for 6 months. But I digress. The exceptionalism peculiar to 21st century Britain, I guess you have it a bit with the United States of America, but that is not comparing apples with apples, helped to explain how people thought that we would be able to defy gravity or do things that no other country would be permitted to do. And you ask the question, but why? Why do you think we'll get away with that? The answer would be, because we're British. Now, that has roots in empire, doesn't it? Why on earth do you think you've got the right to hold dominion over millions of people in India? Well, because we're British, old boy. I mean, it's almost a rhetorical question. If you dig deep into a book like Empire Land by Satnam Sanghera, or you look at the works of historians like David Olsegoya, the question of why do we get to do this? Well, because we're British, old boy. Because we're British. And you see it in modern politics. The most intellectually bankrupt but demagogic speakers are usually people who would answer, well, because we're British, I don't like foreigners. I don't like Romanians. Oh no, sorry, that was in 2014. I don't like Albanians. Oh, sorry, no, that was 2020. I don't like Syrians. I don't like Syrians. Why not? Well, because we're British, old boy. We're British, you see. We're British, so it justifies an empire. Justifies Brexit. How much of it has to do with our museums? How much of it? So you know why they're called the Elgin Marbles and not the Parthenon Marbles? Because a geezer called Elgin brought them back from Greece in the second decade of the 19th century, about 1816. And there's all sorts of stories now about whether Turkish troops were using them for target practice and the circumstances in which he got hold of them. But that entitlement is I've used extraordinary a lot today, but I don't feel I've misused it. I've had permission of 2 or 3 of you to use it as often as I want when discussing the straight-talking Yorkshire woman, Dame Andrea Jenkins, who hates lies, but got made a dame by Boris Johnson. Entitlement. The entitlement attached to arriving in Greece in 1816, seeing some amazing marbles and thinking, oh, I'll have those. Even if some local dignitaries went along with it or some local authorities let you, or there was it's amazing, right? You wouldn't do that now. Well, you might, but you'd get into trouble if you did it. Now, you can't go to Egypt, stumble across something Pharaoh flavoured and think, oh, I'll take that home. That'll look lovely in my side cabinet in Kidderminster. But Lord Elgin, because he's a lord, and it's smack in the middle of empire, arrives in a completely foreign country where he probably doesn't even speak the lingo, sees some amazing marbles and thinks, do you know what? They'd look lovely in the snug back at Elgin Towers. Don't you think those marbles would look lovely just to the left of the bar and underneath the flat screen TV? We need to get those marbles. Load them up, lads. We're taking them home. And he just did. Some of them, of course, have ended up in the British Museum. Some of them, and I thought I was going mad when I remembered this, some of them he kept in his home. I read an article in Tatler about 146 years ago, and it was an interview with the current heir to Elgin, or whatever the correct phraseology is, and they had a couple in their home. Like that, the big stuff went to the British Museum, but they kept a couple just for, giggles. And these are, it's important to remember, these are artefacts of extraordinary historical value. I mean, truly amazing historical value. To whom? Of historical value to whom? Well, in the first instance, to all of humanity. Because the ancient civilizations, in many ways, speak to and speak for us all. But in the most obvious instance, the Greeks. They are of enormous cultural and historical value to the Greeks. So what the hell are they doing in Britain? Speaking now, just to stop the emergency tape from kicking in, but I wanted to hear your little wheels whirring then. I wanted you to hear your little wheels whirring. Chris in Tivertsall suggests that Lord Elgin may have found some marbles, but Andrea Jenkins appears to have lost hers, that's quite well done. Yeah. And I think you're right. Yeah, Mick in Sutton Coldfield reminds us that I think he flogged them in the end to the British Museum in order to fund his divorce, but he also got flogged them by the kind of Turkish authority in Athens at the time. So I think this is linked. I think that British exceptionalism somehow creates the idea that we have every right to keep this stuff. Now, let me suggest to you something else at the same time. If you bought something 10 years ago in good faith and legally, and the person who was selling it to you at the time owned it, you wouldn't be very happy if you were then ordered to give it back, would you? Or somebody... problem is, what about looted Nazi treasure? Or rather, treasure looted by the Nazis. So you're in charge. You can enact legislation to say all of this art now belongs to me. I haven't done Godwin's Law. I'm not having an argument. Godwin's Law, I'm being trolled by my own producer today. Godwin's Law is if you're having an argument and someone says, oh, you're like the Nazis. So if you pass a law and says all your paintings now belong to me, if Donald Trump passes a law and says, right, all the cheeseburgers in the United States of America are now my sovereign property. And it is true, because he's in charge. He passes a law and it becomes the case. And therefore you get the legal defence that I bought it in good faith, according to the laws of the land and the time that I was living in. Therefore it's mine forever. It's mine in perpetuity. But the natural justice of it feels different, doesn't it? It just feels different. So this is not just about the Parthenon Marbles, and the fact that the simple fact that we still call them the Elgin Marbles, highlights the problem that I'm trying to articulate. This is about, and you can send me a message saying Elgin bought the marbles, he didn't steal them. I agree. But there are art dealers in 1950s Germany who bought the paintings that they were selling, despite the fact they'd been looted from murdered Jewish families. So, it's a wrinkle. I'm not comparing like with like. I'm just pointing out that it's not quite the zinger or the argument closer that many people think it is. And should the cultural value, the historical heft of something like the Parthenon Marbles demand a different approach from the one we would adopt to, say, a car or a less magical piece of property? I don't know. But what it does do, because my brain's a strange place at the best of times, it makes me wonder whether museums are wrong. It's a tiny bit Partridge, that. How can museums be wrong? Well, if you've got a museum full of stuff that has been bought, looted, stolen from other cultures and other countries, where the bought, looted, stolen stuff would obviously hold even more importance for the population, then are we just so inured to the idea? Do we all suffer from imperial entitlement, from post-colonial entitlement, because we somehow think these things are ours and we have every right to them? So the Parthenon Marbles are the most obvious example, and they're in the news this week because I think the Greek Prime Minister is in town, and Keir Starmer has said that our position on the Elgin Marbles, he calls them the Elgin Marbles, has not changed. But sources have told some journalists that the chair of the British Museum, George Osborne, God, that lad's talented, isn't he? Could you imagine how talented you have to be just to become editor of the Evening Standard, chair of the British Museum? Whew, I tell you what, if anyone ever suggests that this country is not a meritocracy and that it's not what you know, but who you know, just you show them the new chair, the current chair of the British Museum, George, former editor of the Evening Standard, Osborne. There is all the proof you need that this is a country where it's what you know that gets you to places of prominence, not who you know. I should send out that sarcasm alert, shouldn't I, for the early text, just in case that wasn't obvious. So anyway, it's in the news because there's talks about doing some sort of deal by which the Parthenon marbles will go on display at the Parthenon. And in return, there'll be some artworks that feature in rolling exhibitions in London. But what I want you to do, because I'd like to be wrong on this, I have to tell you, much as I love my inbox, I do occasionally get things. Weren't you against, writes Les, the return of the Stone of Scone to Scotland? I'm fairly confident I have never expressed an opinion in my life on the Stone of Scone, but in fact, there's a lot of debate over how you pronounce that word. Yorkshire people say scone. Southerners say scone, and the big debate is about whether or not you put the cream or the jam on first. But I'd never expressed an opinion on the stone of scone, or the stone of scoon, or even the stone of scone. Les, give your head a wobble. The question I've got for you is this. Just please persuade me that I'm wrong and that museums are great, because I love them. I visit museums quite a lot, actually. It's a wonderful thing to do if you've got a couple of hours to kill, especially now they've shut the Groucho Club. You can go and wander into the British Museum and take in some exhibits, take in some artefacts. So what is the rationale for the existence of museums? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need, because I can't quite see that they're right. I mean, what right have we got to all of this stuff, whether it's from Egypt or Benin, whether it's from Ethiopia or Greece? What right have we got? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:21. So I suppose what I'm asking you is if we have no right to the Parthenon Marbles, if the UK or the British Museum has no right to the Parthenon Marbles, then doesn't the entire concept of museums begin to crumble? It's not your typical radio phone-in, but I hope you'll join in. 0345 6060 973. So I simultaneously think we've got no right to them, and they'd look much better at the Acropolis, where there's a wonderful museum now which actually has gaps in the exhibit waiting for them to be returned. But if you do that, if you say we've got no right to these, then the British Museum, there'll be nothing left in it except a couple of wattle and daub huts and some burnt cakes from King Alfred's time. What do you think? Have I lost the plot, or does that actually make sense? And can you have a crack at making a case for all of these foreign origin artefacts of enormous value, both cultural and material, staying in this country when their countries of origin would rather like them back? Thank you very much. Tess is in Cambridge. Tess, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
So I've just handed in my paper on this, funny enough.
Just this morning?
Well, no, last week.
Oh, God, well, that's no good. I like up-to-date contributors to this programme.
Yeah, unfortunately. I wish it was still in the process, because this is really interesting.
Go on.
My paper was about the Benin bronzes.
Yes.
And about how the conversation isn't as simple as just reparations. We need to have these objects back. It's and how significant these objects are to Britain as well as Nigeria in the case of the Benin bronzes.
Yes.
My issue is with the museum itself. You just said if we returned all of these objects, there wouldn't be a lot in there.
Yes.
And it's true, because the history of the museum, unfortunately, comes out of colonialism. The word that has been circling around my head for months now.
Of course.
It comes out of this idea of
entitlement and a form of ethnic supremacy.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the British Museum, when the Benin bronzes came back, they were sold to offset the cost for the expedition. But also, the British Museums had such an interest in them that they wanted it for the African exhibition, for these items to then go on tour and to be oogled at. And how can such a barbaric society create such beauty?
Wow.
Right?
Okay.
So you had these artifacts promoting British imperialism.
Oh wow!
After they came into so this is the thing. If we understood the history of the British Museum, like you said, there would be no British Museum. A lot of academics and researchers say that the British Museum is the largest organisation with the most stolen goods, most looted goods.
Some of which will be literally looted, some of which would have been bought and sold according to the rules of the time, the rules and the location of the time.
Yes, and this was really for people, Europeans, to safely ogle at such a barbaric society. Obviously, I'm using this in quotation
Yes,
marks.
I know. So I don't quite get that, because is it... So even when the Benin bronzes were created, that society, that culture was barbaric. So it's a sort of...
Well, it's actually really interesting how... I'm sorry to cut you off.
Mate, you've just handed in your masters. I think you're entitled to interrupt me on this subject.
Well, I'm still in the process of my masters.
Or your
I just
thesis,
handed
then.
in my paper.
Yes,
yeah.
okay.
So Benin was such a powerful country, right? It had really strong trade links with Portugal, and Britain wanted a monopoly trade route.
Right.
There's loads of aspects as to why the Benin expedition happened, but this is the one that's most interesting to me, right?
Yes.
So Britain wanted a monopoly trade route with Benin. They wanted all the Benin power to share Benin's power. Benin said no, and because in retaliation killed, some British missionaries.
Oh.
But
down with that sort of thing.
Yeah, we're not obviously. History's very complex,
isn't it?
In retaliation, Britain sought revenge, and it aligned with Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. So to show such great power, they ambushed.
This is making sense now. So you've got this idea that if you believe you've got the right to turn up in a country thousands of miles from home and try and impose dominion over them, then of course you've got the right to help yourself to their artworks.
Yeah.
And what the British Museum represents is a perpetuation of that entitlement, a perpetuation of that right.
It's almost like a trophy case. That's what I write in my paper, but obviously I try not to be as biased. But it's if we really look at the history of a lot of these institutions that rule our society.
Yeah.
Yeah, it all comes down to colonialism.
I might need to explain what that is to Tottenham Hotspur fans listening to this programme, Tess. But I'll let you carry on for now.
But yeah, I mean, I bless my family for letting me chatter about this for months. But all of these institutions, banks, universities, museums are born out of this era from about 1600 to 1800 of colonialism and the British Empire, right?
Yeah. And if you've got the right to do that, you've got the right to do anything. This is absolutely fascinating. Can I ask what the title of your thesis was? Do you mind?
Oh, yeah. So it's called Nigerian History on Display.
Yes.
But it's obviously in the process of being marked now.
Is that it? Doesn't it have a second bit with a question mark at the end?
No, unfortunately not.
Where's the colon, Tess? Nigerian History on Display, colon. Is this a throat? No.
Unfortunately, no. The title is quite boring. But
it's not boring at all. It's just big.
Yes, it's really complex. And
are you pleased with it? Do you think you've aced it?
I hope. Well, I don't want to jinx anything. So.
All right. Okay. We won't do that then. Will you let us know how you get on?
Oh, definitely.
I mean it though. I genuinely mean it. Will you ring while we're on air one day? Just ring in and tell us, "Hey, I'm Tess. I'm the one that did the master's thesis on Nigerian art on display. Can you let James know I just got the best first in my year?"
I hope so. Fingers crossed. I will definitely keep you updated, though.
And I'd quite like to read it at some point as well. Because you've been such a great community. Do you do an oral exam? Do you have to do an oral?
No.
Oh well, that's a shame.
No, but I'm on my way to talk to some people about it. So it's interesting. There's interesting stuff happening, but definitely.
Well, there you go. There's lots of people getting in touch with this programme to say that they wish they were in the audience. Well, they didn't know you were about to go and talk to it, but they're saying they could listen to you a lot more. This caller writes, Miss P is so engaging, I could listen to her for much longer. I'd like to read more of what she's saying. So there you go, Tess. There's a book in this, in my humble opinion. 29 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think Tony might be a Spurs fan. So when did Kidderminster last win a major trophy, James? To which I can only respond by saying, yeah, fair enough. Amelia Cox has got the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
£95 million went on, quotes, investment to optimise capacity within the existing detention estate and options to increase detention capacity. This is from Lizzie Darden's report on the finer detail of the 750 million quid that Braverman and Cleverly, Sunak and Patel, Johnson and the rest of them spent on sending precisely nobody to Rwanda. Some people went of their own volition, but they weren't actually asylum seekers. They'd already had their applications processed and they'd failed. Just extraordinary. Is there a show in where did all the money go? What does that even mean? The only thing I know about them improving the existing detention estate, and I use the word improving very loosely, was when honest Bob Jenrick paid for, or used your money to pay contractors to paint over murals of Disney characters in case the place was too welcoming for unaccompanied child asylum seekers who'd just crossed the English Channel in a dinghy. I mean, the mind boggles. 33 minutes after 12 is the time. Back to the rather vexed question of museums, artefacts and ownership, because the Prime Minister of Greece is in town, which, as night follows day, means we're having a chat about the Parthenon Marbles. A chat that begins by pointing out that many people, including Keir Starmer's spokesperson, still calls them the Elgin Marbles. So they're named after the Brit what got them, as opposed to the place where they were got from. Gary's in Calais. Gary, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. A great programme, interesting as well.
Thank you, Gary.
I think what we're looking at is the territory that goes with empire and wealth.
Yes.
From when these houses were created, many of them 200 years ago, 150 years ago. And we always tend to go down that route of the Parthenon Marbles. If we then start to look at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and what's there and how that was accumulated as well, it's either through trophy of arms, war, looted, or purchased.
Yeah.
In St. Petersburg, they've got the Bible that was carried by Mary Queen of Scots when she was executed.
Wow.
That was bought at auction, I think about 1900, 1904. That should be in Scotland.
Well, who sold it?
It should not be in Russia.
Who sold it?
It went through auction in the UK. Now, you can argue that many of the items nefariously were purchased.
Yeah, but we don't know that this wasn't... I mean, chances are it was the executioner who slipped it in his pocket on his way off the scaffold.
No. It went through a major auction house. Let's go back to 1904.
I'm talking about going back to Mary Queen of Scots. How did the Bible end up on sale? I said it was probably the executioner, not the auctioneer, who just decided that was like a perk of the job, wasn't it? You chop someone's head off, you keep their Bible.
Some clothes, that sort of thing, and you were paid decent money and what have you.
Yes.
Now, you've also got to look as well, let's go to the French Revolution and Versailles. Much of Versailles was ripped out, sold at auction on the lawns at Versailles, purchased by wealthy English people, and at one point there was more furniture from Mary Antoinette's bedroom sitting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art than at Versailles.
This was after the Revolution, was it?
It was actually during the Revolution.
Yeah, as part of the Revolution, like a kind of yard, like a yard sale, like Robespierre's yard sale when they knocked off all Louis' furniture to the highest bidder. This is a valid point. But I mean, there's always a but. I like big buts. I cannot lie. There's a difference between personal belongings and national heritage. So
then we look at this.
Hang on, let me get the thought out, man, will you? The Parthenon Marbles never really belonged to anyone. Not they belonged to Greece, and then they belonged
their empire
to Elgin.
Well, were they right? Then they become in the Ottoman Empire, etc.
Yeah.
And we go through various empires. The French have had at least 2 empires.
I did all this in the introduction, Clever Clogs. I did indeed. So you don't think anything ever gets returned to its place of origin?
I think there are many things that should be returned.
Right.
I think things like the Parthenon. I think you've got to look at when, as we spoke about through war, you've got the Germans, the Prussians arrive in Paris in 1815.
Yeah.
Much of it goes to Berlin.
Of course.
From Berlin in 1945, it then ends up in Russia, where it's been locked away, the Nefertiti stuff. And you're thinking, where do we go with that? How are we now going to get that back? So it's a real spiral.
It's a fascinating spiral, and yet we both believe that there is a threshold that could be made by human hand, below which the case for return becomes uncontestable.
I think there are many things when you look at... You get a Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Yeah.
Look what's there. You go... I was there one day where a load of German Navy cadets walked along. The man said, pointed to the Bruegel, and then walked them off again. You walk through things at the finest sets of Greenwich armour.
A Bruegel?
A bridle.
I thought you said a
sir.
bridle. I thought, what have they got bridles on display in the museum?
Probably the phone line.
No, it was. Probably, yeah. So that has German, resonance. That has a peculiarly German resonance for
and
those.
The French stuff that you've got there, the Dutch mask. You've got Stubbs in there. You've got the Reynolds that are in there. Some of the most iconic English paintings of all time.
Someone give this man a TV show. Do you want an art TV show?
Why not, sir?
Oh, you could do it with your eyes shut.
The last suit of armour worn by Henry VIII in battle is sitting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
How did it get there?
Here we go again. We're going back to the turn of the last century when things were going to auction that should never have left the country. Today they wouldn't.
And that is why the question of historical relativism is as key here as cultural or geographical relativism. So under your glorious rule, you'd send the Parthenon Marbles back, but we'd have to have some very long conversations about a lot of other stuff in almost every museum in the world.
And if you want the weirdest one of the lot, wedding presents bought by Napoleon for Josephine, come from China, captured by the Royal Navy, are sitting in the Victoria and Albert Museum.
So on their way from China to France, intercepted by the British Royal Navy, and now sitting in a national museum.
Absolutely.
All right, final question. If my peacock laid an egg in your garden, who would it belong to?
Probably the rats. We've got a problem at the moment.
No, mate, peacocks don't lay eggs. It's peahens.
Well done. And they've got the peacock throne, of course, in St. Petersburg.
You're so good. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Top man, Gary. Thank you. And there it is. It's complicated, which is why the leap from the Parthenon Marbles to the rest of it was perhaps a leap too far, or certainly a leap into the unknown. Oh, every day's a school day. Andy's in Tiverton. Andy, what would you like to say?
Thank you, mate, and great show. Hard to follow the previous caller.
Yeah, good luck. I'm staying quiet.
I mean, a couple of quick bits, really.
Yes,
the first one was I was in China not long ago, went to the huge museum in Beijing, and it really struck me how absent other people's stuff was. It was very much just about the cultural history of China, the archaeological and cultural history. And I couldn't believe how there wasn't an esophagus from here, there wasn't that from there. It was just Chinese culture, and it was still a really rich cultural experience. But I guess because I would like the artifacts to be returned, right? And my reasoning is, in the UK, we have protection of different spaces, right? So I have a listed building that I live in, and different spaces, artifacts are protected by Heritage England. We have legislation to stop people buying, and when they do buy, to protect those things that are important to our cultural heritage, right, our identity.
Yes.
Now, other countries didn't necessarily have those things in place while we were over there exploiting, taking advantage, buying, plundering, or whatever else you want to call it. And now those spaces potentially have both the will to get that stuff back and, more importantly, things in place to protect their own artifacts and heritage and so on, and a bit of security. And so my feeling is that we should honour that. It's like if you have a kid that joins the first year in a new school and they go round to visit a friend and play at their house and they're like, oh, I really like that, can I have it? And the kid goes, yeah, all right, and gives it to them. But that kid's got no right to give it away, right?
Yeah.
You know, the parents would be like, hang on a second, you're not really supposed to have that. It belongs to them, doesn't it? And you give it back.
I like that analogy. It works pretty well. Also, I mean, even on the question of the Parthenon Marbles, my friend Alexis has just sent me a page from a book he's reading, which shows that even the claim that it's a signed letter to the Prime Minister at the time, Spencer Perceval, in which he admits that he didn't have the authority he later claimed that he possessed when he helped himself to the marbles, to the Parthenon Marbles. So we don't even have the Turkish... the local Turkish dignitary giving him permission to take the marbles back to Blighty. But what about? I mean, I know it's not easy to follow someone who's as extremely well informed as Gary. But what about all of the cases where things are really murky? What about something taken in war, that you've won the battle? You are now the occupying force in Paris. Therefore, you'll help yourself to the contents of the Louvre, stick them all in Goebbels' Rolls-Royce and send them back to Berlin. You are in charge of Paris. So what rules are you breaking in that moment?
Well, one would like to think that if Paris was ever recovered, that you'd be forced to give Paris back along with any of the stuff that went with it, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you'd like to think that.
Occupies someone else's land and steals their stuff.
But we've all done that.
Sorry, go on.
Well, I say we've all done that. Just for the record, I've never occupied anybody's land and stolen their stuff. But we might. What if I get a Plantagenet ringing in to complain about the Tudors stealing their land? I mean, at some point, you might get the descendants of Harold Godwinson have still got beef with William of Normandy. Everyone has stolen land at some point and helped themselves. That's why you do it. That's why armies exist, to steal stuff, to steal land and then send all the spoils back to the boss.
That's right, and hopefully one day we'll be past all that.
Who are you, John Lennon? Well, hopefully one day we'll be past all that, but we're not past it yet. The Rosetta Stone is a big one. The fact that that's not in Egypt. So you're going around museums in Egypt, museum in Egypt, and the Rosetta Stone's here. Andy's right, but we're not there yet, are we? We're not in the place yet where there's. Imagine there's no museums. That was the next verse. That's the verse that John Lennon never got around to writing. Imagine there's no museums and no school trips too. It's coming up to 1:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I told you this was more interesting than it initially appears to be. The idea, well, should we, shan't we? Will we, won't we? Will he, won't we? Will we join the dance? It's not about that. It's about everything. It's about the nature of humanity, the nature of acquisition. It's about warfare. It's about empire. It's about colonialism. It's about entitlement. And crucially, it's about exceptionalism. It's not unique to Britain to think that your accident of birth has given you, what did that fella say? Was it Churchill? Who said the sort of winning ticket in life, or the being, by dint of being born an Englishman, you've won the lottery of life, or something like that. I don't know why I did that voice when I don't know who it was that said it, but it was vaguely Churchillian. We shall fight them. It's all there, and it's in a museum that only exists because there's a cultural inculcation that we all have at some point. Some of us may have moved beyond it. Some of us may still be up to our ears in it. A cultural inculcation that we've got every right to this stuff. And I tell you what, I refuse at the moment to step back from the observation that it's linked absolutely intrinsically to the idea that we had every right to up sticks to Delhi and then claim that we were suddenly in charge of the entire bloody continent. If you can get that past the umpire, then you can help yourself to whatever the heck you want from the natural resources and cultural. I think it was Cecil Rhodes who said that, which kind of makes my point even more powerfully than I originally intended.
James O'Brien on LBC.
48. A few years ago, William Dalrymple, who of course is a brilliant author and recent guest on Full Disclosure, he described the UK as needing a museum of colonialism so that children could be taught about imperial history. Even in 2020, he was required by the mores of the time to add that it would not be a matter of being woke. Because remember, facts are woke. For people who don't like facts. You see, there's another link there with exceptionalism. If you're somebody who believes that being born an Englishman means you won the lottery of life, like the man who literally took over an entire country and named it after himself in the middle of Africa. So if you still subscribe to that, whether you're a forklift truck driver in Warrington or whether you're sitting in the House of Lords thanks to the patronage of Boris Johnson, that's why you voted for Brexit, because you thought we'd be fine. Johnny Foreigner has to obey by the rules. We don't. Rule Britannia. Britannia waives the rules. And you hate the idea of proper history being shared. The National Trust is going to do what? It's going to put history of the actual houses, so everyone will know that all of these fantastic jewels in the crown of Great Britain's magnificence historically, they're all nicked, or the proceeds of slavery. So shut up. Just keep the facts secret. So we'll build our own museums, and we'll call them the Elgin Marbles. What? Who's Elgin? Well, he stumbled across them in 1816. And when were these marbles carved? Well, a rough estimate, I would say about 400 BC, maybe. I've done that completely off the top of my head. May have made a complete fool of myself. But, consider they've been around a hell of a lot longer than old Johnny Elgin, if indeed his name was Johnny. But British exceptionalism, post-colonial what, creates this idea, A, that we've got every right to them, and B, that they're somehow ours naturally. And C, why? Well, because we're British, old boy, and we've won the lottery of life. Lil's in Roughton. Roughton or Rawton?
Rawton.
Rawton in Wiltshire.
Good afternoon.
Hello, Lil.
Yeah. Good afternoon, James. When you gave the list of things that our museums is about, there was one word that was missing, and I think it's pivotal, and that word is consent.
Yes.
I think that museums are fantastic. They're brilliant. They open up a world to children that they wouldn't normally see, and adults.
Yes, same
beyond
here.
books.
Yes, I agree.
So I think museums are vitally important, but it's 2024, and everything that's in our museums should be there by consent of its original owners. Yes, we would lose some things, but you've got to also bear in mind that our major museums have huge storage facilities. We're only seeing a small part of their collection. So actually, we would lose some things because people would say, well, actually, you've asked us if you can keep it, and no, we'd quite like it back, thank you very much. But there's so much of our own history that's locked away in storage cabinets and warehouses, etc.
That's not a case. That's not in and of itself a grounds for sending stuff back. It's a suboptimal situation with regards to artefacts that we have, but it doesn't challenge our right to have them necessarily.
I think that we need to be able to move on.
But what if you had consent? So I looted some art from Paris in 1943, and I had permission to do it from the people in charge in Paris. Because guess what?
It's now.
That was me. I was in charge in Paris.
But it's about now.
It can't
It's
be.
about not going. Why not?
Well, because I'm trying to think of a zinger, but it's quite late. It's quite late. I get tired at about 12 o'clock. 12:30, depends what I put in my shake this morning. You can't, because if it's about now, then who could give permission? See, we don't suffer from this, do we? This is part of the problem, Lil. I can't think, apart from Mary Queen of Scots' Bible, which, did you know, is in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Apart from that, I can't think of something that is ineffably British, which currently languishes in a foreign museum because they once conquered us, or they once invaded us, or they once robbed us blind. That's another.
There probably are.
Well,
one of the arguments about why the British Museum just can't give the things back to the people who say, excuse me, that's ours, can I have it back?
Yes.
Is because of the constitutions and the laws that were written about the British Museum.
Yes.
Why don't we change them? Why don't we go back to Parliament?
Well, because we don't want to give them, but we don't want to give them back. Is one answer to that. It's not the one I would provide, but it certainly fits the space you've just carved out.
Yeah. So it's about selfishness. It's about holding on
Is it?
to.
Is it that simple? Does it boil down to selfishness?
I think we're incredibly selfish.
And that's where I use the word exceptionalism. And actually, we've just built another layer of exceptionalism because there aren't any examples of things that have been taken from this country as a consequence of looting, theft or conquest. Because William the Conqueror, who was the last person to conquer us, that's why he's called William the Conqueror, kids, he kept the country. He didn't just empty it and take it all back to Normandy. He decided, quite rightly, to settle here instead. So there is no example. The Romans, but I mean, it's not as if there's an empire. It's not like there's a museum in Rome full of prehistoric British artifacts because Caesar wanted all the little flint axes sent back home. We don't have a two-way. Many countries will have two-way relationships with this, but we don't.
I mean, and we've been fantastic gatekeepers over the years. Have you ever heard of a woman called Lady Mew? Lady who? Mew. M-E-U-X.
No.
She was wonderful.
Was
now, if she started off as a banjo playing barmaid, and she married well.
Right.
And she was a fantastic eccentric. Society didn't like her because she was a barmaid. She, instead of having horses for her carriage, she had zebras.
Wow, I like the sound of her already. Did she keep up the banjo?
Yes, she did. There are photos. So she, so near Enfield, there's a big house, used to be called Theobald's. It's now a fancy hotel. That's where her and her husband lived. And she
can't find it. N-E-U-X? N-E-U-X?
Yes. Lady Mew. Valerie Mew.
Valerie Mew.
Yeah. And she was a great collector of things. lots of Egyptological stuff, but she also managed to acquire some manuscripts that were very important to Ethiopians, these Ethiopian religious manuscripts. And a chap from Ethiopia before came across and said, they're really important to us. Right. They're part of our heritage. So she said, that's brilliant. In my will, you can have them back.
She said, hold my banjo.
So in my will, I will give them back to you.
Oh, how lovely.
And then the British court said, no, you can't do that.
Oh.
You can't give them back. We're going to stop you because actually we need to keep hold of them.
And we haven't changed at all.
But no, we didn't actually keep them because we decided, no, we don't really want them. So we auctioned them off to the highest bidder. Oh, my Lord. And they went to an American. I can't
find hide nor hair of Lady New, but I shall dig a little deeper after the programme. I think I found a response to your thing about consent and permission.
Oh, okay.
So we could get America back under your theory.
But America's not a thing. We can't talk about
It's definitely
people.
a thing. It's definitely a thing. It's just over there on the other side of the Atlantic.
I know. I pretend it doesn't exist.
So where's the consent there, eh? So you need consent from the modern state from which you took it. So George III did not consent to the removal of America from his sovereign rule.
That was then.
So they need to come back now, under your theory, they need to come back now, and they need to ask Keir Starmer for permission to stay independent, and Keir Starmer would say, no.
But he wouldn't, would he?
That's not the point. He could, couldn't he?
He could, but he wouldn't. He wouldn't, and the king wouldn't.
All right. Well, I don't know about the king. He's a dark horse. He's quite cross at the moment because no one wants any of his pictures. Have you seen that story?
I did.
All these pictures of the king and nobody wants them. And staying with matters historical, you'll like this, Lil. So will Gary. Gary in Calais almost certainly knows this already, but you might not. I think it's on telly tonight or tomorrow as well, but they have found, talking about wills and Mary, Queen of Scots Bible, did you know that they've been pretty certain for a while about who killed the princes in the Tower, but for the first time ever, they have found a will which contains a chain that belonged to one of the princes, Edward V, as he briefly was. Well, as he always will be, but obviously he died quite soon after. A chain that belonged to him, found in the will of one of the niece or the sister-in-law. The sister-in-law, we must get this right. Vanessa Feltz is in the room. She's a stickler for detail.
Hello, I am.
The sister-in-law of the man believed to be one of the executioners of the Princes in the Tower. And that is on telly tomorrow night, featuring, presented by the wonderful Jason Watkins, who's also appeared on Full Disclosure. It never ends. So there it is, the historian who unearthed evidence linking the Princes in the Tower. This is today's news to their alleged, it's today's news. It also goes back quite far. The discovery warrants DNA testing on the remains that are believed to be the remains of the young royal. And that is it for another day. If you missed any of today's programme, you can listen on catch up at globalplayer.com, where you can rewind and pause live radio as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now standing in for Sheila Fogarty, as you may have gathered, it's Vanessa Feltz.
James O'Brien on LBC.